see. You hear me good?
It's a little muffled, and there's a slight echo. So I'm wondering if that's me causing it. Let's see, I might have to. I'm using both phone and computer, so I'll just mute one. Okay, that should help.
Okay. Yeah, I don't.
All right. So
Yeah, I don't hear the lag on me so much.
echo.
I guess it's
Okay.
good.
So I can basically end the one on the phone, the connection on the phone, and just use the computer connection. Or does anyone recommend against that?
I hear you so nicely, man.
Okay, I'll leave the phone alone.
It's
And,
I mean, I don't.
the computer.
Is it coming through the speaker and you're getting feedback? Is that why I hear myself?
Well, I'm hearing feedback, but I don't know how it's what's causing it because I'm using a headset, and the only thing I can think of is because the phone is also connected. But I muted the phone's mic, so what I'll do is, as I said, I'll end it on the phone. See if that doesn't. Well, no, I don't want to end the conversation. This will end it for everyone, so no. Okay. I don't know. I'm going to exit out of it. I'll leave it as it is. Obviously, there's nothing I can do about it on the phone end.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll just speak using the computer device or the laptop.
Okay. Let me just say a few things, just so I can see if it's got some lag. I don't hear myself now though. I think it's fine now.
Yeah, it should be okay now.
Okay. Cool. Yeah. It seems to be no feedback on my end now.
Okay.
So yeah.
Looks like, how do you see who's here? And if anyone's here, just chat or type or speak if you can. I don't see where anyone's listed.
It should be. Let's see.
I see now.
Yeah,
Okay,
6
there we
others.
go.
It says 6 others and 1 other listener.
6? I see only 4.
Oh yeah, 4. It says 4 besides us, I guess, and then 1 other listener.
Okay, got it. I got a thumbs up from someone named Cyber Ninja and Z. Okay, so they're able to hear us.
Cool.
And you said there's a chat room here.
It should.
Okay.
Yeah, it should. Yeah, that you got to click on that little comment bubble with the numbers of the guests if you guys want to message anything to Pharaoh.
This is a first for me, so folks.
Yeah, it's my first.
I've never really used it.
It's my
Oh,
first
yours too,
spaces.
okay.
Yeah, it's my first spaces too.
It's definitely different.
Yeah, it's easier, like you said, to get people to ask questions just like with their voice instead of like how you got to do it on Instagram.
Right, because I'm reading and looking at the chat room and talking is
Yeah.
not the best thing.
Okay. Well,
All right.
yeah, I'm just right now. Right now I'm letting people know that that we're on X, on all the other platforms that I'm on with my other phone. So everybody that is on Facebook and Instagram, they should know to follow at Pharaoh's House on X to get it to. They want to be in the spaces and they want to talk in the spaces and comment and ask questions.
Okay. Yeah. Right now it's set to everyone, so anyone can join the chat.
Cool. All right. Well, I guess we don't want to waste any more time, and have any more delay here. So, how you doing, Pharaoh?
Okay.
How you doing over there?
How are you? How are you? I'm going to turn off some of the background noises here. Okay. How are you?
I'm good. We took a loss today, but my body's good. So I'm glad you go through. Anytime I guess you go through the gladiator sport, and you come out with your body intact, I guess it's a win on a personal level somehow. But yeah, could be better days, I guess, in that respect. But I'm glad that I still got my health I still got good energy because on game days I keep it light with the intake. So I think we can have a really good time right now.
Perfect. When you're out there running up against different sizes of body types, does your defense, do they provide the best protection, or do you actually have to sometimes withstand the brunt of a person who might be twice your size?
Yeah, I definitely have to deal with people that are like heavier than me and and bigger guys and stuff like that. But I think the fact that I grew up in America, played with a lot of melanated folks, I think it kind of it keeps it. I know how to, I guess, roll with the punches and protect myself so I don't take any of those bad hits. Because I'm not playing with guys from Florida and Alabama, and it's a little different. The speed isn't like that. It's not like America, so that's good.
Okay, so no GMO corn-fed people.
Yeah, but I don't know. I don't know if it might be guys on steroids, but I think Americans. I don't know if it's the circumcision or what, but Americans are just way more violent. Whether they be pale or dark skinned, it's just a more violent game in America than it is in other places. Slavic countries, I think, are they're pretty violent as well, but it's nothing like America's violence on the field.
Oh yeah, they're sneaky in the sense of it's in a culture to be sneaky. And for anyone listening, this is not a across the board casting of aspersions on any particular group. I'm just saying certain ways of being are inculcated into each culture. So, for example, you could find sneakiness if you go to Central America or South America. Colombia, for example. Sneakiness is not looked upon as something that is disgusting or something that's going to be lambasted by the group. In other words, it's okay if you're sneaky, depending on what activity. If it's a commercial, you're selling something, especially if you're not doing it to your own. If it's done to your own, it's frowned upon, but you still might even maintain a connection to that person, or you might create a familial grudge. But I've been to many countries, and I know where the sneakiness mindset is okay if it is perpetrated against the so-called foreigner. So if you're not from a particular country, it's okay to rip someone off, whatever you can do to get yours, that kind of mentality. Does it exist in the U.S. and some European countries? Probably, but it's not accepted. It's frowned upon if someone sees someone doing it. And then, of course, you've got so-called safeguards. You go into most commercial establishments, the prices are there. You can't charge somebody extra just because, you sense the way they're dressed or the way they look that they're not your country person. But I've noticed that in many cultures, it's okay to do that. And it crosses the board of activity. So whether it be sports or whether it be just any other activity, there are certain behaviors that are seen as vices that many have accepted, as long as it's perpetrated against someone who's not your own. And this is a disgusting fact that I think the arrogance of humanity itself, by allowing these things, we'll have to answer to. You're supposed to be across the board, no matter who it is. You treat everyone as you want to be treated.
Yeah, that's what I heard. That's why Yiddish was formed, because I heard Yiddish is like a mix of Slavic and Germanic, and it was a way for merchants to talk in another language so that the customer wouldn't know what they were saying.
Right, to get an edge, exactly. So it's terrible, but it exists, as I said, in many different cultures. Not a lot. Some cultures frown upon it. You find, but then that same culture might have another vice that is disgusting. but is seen as a norm or is accepted. The ones with the least vices are the ones that you want to associate with, but you have to get to know people on a basic level or individual level, as well as travel and see how people act in groups. And the so-called marketplace is one place where you can see the seedier side of human activity or sentient activity.
Yeah.
And so far, aggression in sports, the so-called American aggression, that's, again, like I said, I used the word inculcated. Aggression is inculcated in many facets from the food to the media to the music. And it's targeted at particular, well, there's no such thing as particular, but it's targeted at one gender or the other. I'm not going to get caught up in the multiple gender thing, but it's targeted at males and, susceptible males. It's targeted at females, but from a different perspective. It doesn't pay to have both genders aggressive, but you see you can't harm one without the other. It's like the sentient body, the vessel. You cannot do one thing to one part without it affecting all other parts eventually. So aggression it's not only aggression, but the manipulation of your biochemistry that can bring about aggressive mentality or aggressive behavior. We look at the food supplies here, I guarantee you the foods you're getting over there in Switzerland are not like the foods you get in the U.S. In fact, many of the foods that are sold in the U.S. are banned in the EU and in also, some parts of Asia. That's why when I hear read these news reports about tariffs, I say to myself, they're definitely not talking about foods or foodstuffs because most countries ban the food supplies coming out of the U.S.
Yeah, I mean most of the stuff is non-GMO. I don't know what they feed the cattle, but like as far as like what's on the shelves, a lot more stuff is non-GMO in the EU and Switzerland. I feel like the quality of things is definitely better.
Mm-hmm. And you have to find out what are the numbers. What does the average American, so-called American, eat from a certain point in their life, when their formative years on through. And there's a large percentage of so-called omnivorous eaters, starting with, eating of beef and pork. And those are two primary conduits for mood-altering, testosterone-altering, endocrine-altering substances. So, and you can also, obviously, when you eat certain substances, most don't know, they're not taught in typical nutrition class or biology class that one thing or two things in combination will deduct or subtract from some other thing. In other words, mineral deduction, mineral subtraction. So magnesium, for example, will be deducted or subtracted if you ingest certain types of meat, such as pork and beef, especially if that pork and that beef has been tainted with hormones, certain types of hormones, the growth hormone in particular. And many of those protein powders that people get, I would never recommend anyone take those. And if you have, it's just as bad as getting any type of heavy pharmaceutical out of your bloodstream. Do not ingest those things. They might give you this instant rush, but most of it is so-called mental, psychological, experimental. You're getting full of carbohydrates. You're spiking your blood sugar. You're getting a low value or low grade form of protein, usually some type of whey. And if you saw how whey is mass produced, you would stay away from it. So it's almost like drinking edible or eating edible laundry detergent. I mean, it looks like it. You could probably substitute it and put one in a box, another in another box, and someone would wash their clothes with protein powder, not realizing it's not so. I wouldn't touch that stuff, and I wouldn't recommend it. I know many people utilize it. They think they're getting what they want, the gains, the cuts, but it's like Rogaine. As soon as you stop, you notice what happens. You marble, you get chunky, and then people start to put on weight. You want to stay healthy, work on your spine. You want to maintain posture, work on your breathing and spine, your every muscle in your body, and then definitely what goes with that is your nutrition. And you'll stay this way for a long time. You can stay this way as long as you're on this planet, so-called planet. You don't have to go up and down and up and down. But you notice most people go up and down and then they just cease. You can spot the former so-called athletes, so-called former bodybuilders, and this current trend with, I just call it swollen look, the swollen female. That is going to result in a lot of malformed children, a lot of so-called birth defects. It's not a birth defect, it's a defect as a result of something environmental or something that the mother has done to herself. And then, of course, you're going to see a lot of so-called cognitive misfunctions or dysfunctions, rather, and primarily in males. Those are the ones who are usually burdened with these natal issues. All of them are artificial, so don't let anyone tell you otherwise. From ADHD to hyperactivity, these are all environmental. No child is automatically that way.
Yeah, I just feel like
the so-called meds exacerbated. Go ahead. Pardon.
No, I was gonna say I just feel like the swelling just ruins the suppleness of the skin, and it kind of makes like birth complication so much more common, and like it makes natural birth actually dangerous, I guess, because they don't have the suppleness and they could rip and tear because of all that swelling.
Mm-hmm. The use of epidurals and the procedure of C-section or cesarean section has gone up a lot since, I guess, in the last 25 years. And that's when you notice this whole Jessica Rabbit craze. And it's not like the female body to have, it's supposed to have curves, but not everyone has the same type of curves. You shouldn't force something that's not there. And all of this is artificial. And any true sentient male who's clear thinking would not want to mess with something so toxic. Pardon me when I say something, but that's what a woman is a female is turning herself into, something. If you saw the chemicals and this and that that's in it, and the types of clothing and then the food. In fact, it's not just the females, the males too. If you see the foods, you're turning into something as opposed to someone. Most of these things have plastics, petrochemicals. It's kind of the same type of material that little girls used to feed the doll babies or dolls in the 60s and 70s when they came out with those dolls that are baby dolls that are supposedly realistic. So you put these polymer beads in some water and it looks like tapioca or it looks like pudding, and you feed it to this doll that has this kind of peristalsis looking mouth. And I don't know why they did these things. The old-fashioned way was just put water in a bottle and stick it in the thing, and then turn the thing upside down when the receptacle got full, and the child would imagine, the baby wet itself. But then they started to add all these other things, to give it this look and appeal that it's actually eating. Well, that same food is the stuff that people are being fed now. When your parents, for people who were born in the 40s, 50s, or 60s, your parents would tell you not to eat certain things that were what you played with, whether it would be clay or Play-Doh or any of the other so-called toys that would probably be considered toxic these days that children played with. They would say, don't eat it. So unless you were from that shorter bus, you probably didn't eat it. There are others who did. They had that kind of Neanderthal mindset. They would eat glue and paste, but still, they knew better, and it didn't kill the child. But now your very food is made up of those same substances that parents then warned their children not to eat, and then some. So it's not just the glues. You've got glue in most of your products, casein. You've got, especially if it's a vegetarian, so-called vegan product, particularly the so-called meat products or meat mimickers, that's what I call them. And then, of course, you see it in your dairy products as well. From your fake cheese to your it's all fake, the real cheese and the fake cheese. But they have that in common. And I didn't want to get sidetracked. I just wanted to set that out here as a precursor while everyone is still entering the room. So go ahead with your first question, or if anyone else has a question.
Damn, I mean, like that. I guess it's for on topic what we were saying. I guess, wanted to know how long should a child be breastfed? Since we were talking about that, but just to, I guess, to wrap that up a little bit. I don't know. Just a question I always wanted to kind of really get a better answer on.
Well, first and foremost, if the mother has been in a stress-free environment, setting or niche, that environment, and she has been ingesting the nutrients that are going to help strengthen the structure of the child, the bones, the joints, the collagen, etc., then she's safe. But if she hasn't, doesn't matter how long that child's breastfeeding. In fact, the longer, the more she's actually probably doing some harm to the child. But what is the alternative? It's not formula. The best alternative would be a healthy mother in her family who's also lactating that could possibly breastfeed the child. You can do it with they have a breast pump. She can use that to use the milk from a relative and then have that done. If she knows that she's not healthy as far as her overall so-called dietary habits and the fact that she's probably lacking nutrients, you can't just load up, which is what allopathic physicians will put that out there. They know that it's not true. They won't come out and say it, but they know that the mentality and the misinformation leads women to believe, oh, I can just load up on supplements like some athlete, and now I've got everything I need and I can go breastfeed. Doesn't work that way. And then, of course, the things that they have mothers load up on are the promoted, they're still pharmaceuticals, and so you're probably going to get a lot of iron. They're probably going to tell you, oh, you need a lot of folate, but they miss the entire family of nutrients that are probably best through foods as opposed to some pills and capsules. But they usually tell them the typical ones because they get kickbacks for these as well. And there are a lot of other deficiencies or a lot of other areas that they can address nutrition-wise, but they don't. And this, of course, does not help the newborn at all. And of course, I'm not just referring to newborns. I'm referring to while she's still carrying, while the mother's still carrying. That's very important. It's almost, if you think of it like a plant, you have a certain phase for each part of the growth of a plant, and during each phase, you have to take advantage of what should be done and what it can absorb. After a certain point, when it gets to the near harvest, it's kind of late. You start putting fertilizers in there. And once, depending on the type of plant, once it gets to like a molting stage, whatever it's called, when something turns to turn into seed, again, too late. You have to do that from a certain point in the seed phase, and also the soil, nutrify the soil, and then, of course, not only nutrify it, but perhaps do things to it, such as maybe cook it, or put clean lime in order to get rid of parasites, and not just nematodes. There are a ton of other parasites that people miss. And then don't go crazy on nitrogen, which is, again, forced and pushed. They want you to go heavily on nitrogen. There's more that is necessary in the soil than just nitrogen. You see the NPK on a lot of the bags that are sold in most stores, but there's a lot more that you can put into your soil that is necessary and required, definitely depending on where you are. I know when I learned from the people that taught me, from those that taught me, it also depends on where you are in relation to whether it's mountains, foothills, water. So every soil type is going to be different, and it will have access to different nutrients. based on what comes through it and what you do to it. It helps to have some type of animals to contribute to that soil, whether it be goats, sheep, or even bovine animals or cows, and then even chickens if that's all you can get to actually defecate into the ground, and then you can use that as fertilizer in addition to your compost. So many different things you should do. And this is where you would get your primary source foods, whether it's a micronutrient, and this is what you would eat or feed to your wife, your expecting wife, if you're expecting, well, the expecting mother. These will be the staples that she would eat. So this will ensure that your infant has everything they need from her breast milk and beyond.
Yeah, I mean, as far as my experience with growing cannabis, if you introduce fertilizer too late, it's just going to burn the roots. And,
correct.
Yeah.
So, exactly.
Yeah. Everything is the timing's got to be right. It's a year-round thing. It's not like you just start planting seeds. Like you gotta prime the soil. You gotta situate your life to be able to take care of it. It's the same thing. It's even more, I guess, intensive if you're having a child. So it's crazy that the way people have children is wild.
Well, you and I mentioned this before regarding that. I think years ago when I mentioned that the preparation doesn't just start once you are impregnated or that you have impregnated. It starts prior to that. You build up to it, and that is what is not done. Everything. I don't mind going over it quickly again. You have to build up to it from yourself, getting your gonads in order, decluttering them, making sure you have no cysts lurking about, cleansing yourself of parasites throughout that year, because you're going to, you're planning, exactly when you are going to start the conception process, exactly when. So for example, you want to conceive in the so-called month of April, you would be doing all of your cleansing, purging, fasting in that winter. And then you would be ready by the time you pick the date, preferably based on the numerological and so-called astrological frame-up. And of course, your moon cycles. You now are helping in many ways, both of you, especially for the sentient that is to arrive, the offspring. You're helping before he even gets there. Kind of like financial planning. So when he gets there, it will know, he or she will know their conception timing as well as their so-called natal timing or so-called birth timing. They'll have both, and they're supposed to have both. You got two parents. So you want to have that information, and most people don't even do that to the bedroom that you do it in. You have a birthing room, you ask any doula or so-called midwife, the ones who know, and they know that you have to set up a specific type of room where you're going to, you don't just do it, because I like the color in this room, or that's the room we just put the swimming pool in. No, it has to be in a place that is conducive to everything. So you would find the place in your home if you have it. Otherwise, maybe you have to go someplace else. And then you would conceive in that place, but it has to be prepared first. Be prepared from top to bottom. And it sounds to those who are listening right now perhaps as overboard or too much or far-fetched. Okay. I'm not going to attempt to change your way of imagining things or so-called thinking. That's you. But know this. The planning that you put into baking a cake or buying a car, you should think about the next time, if you do plan on, or if you already have conceived. You probably put more planning, and more than likely did put more planning in all those other things, which says what's more important to you. You're putting an offspring, a sentient, into the mix of what you call family and also the world of other sentients, as they will interact with them. And what you put there, and then of course they're going to interact with everything too. You make a huge difference. So you want to make sure these things are done prior to.
Yeah, for sure. And like, I guess that rolls into the beginning of what I wanted to start with. I wanted to go into the Real ID thing, and I guess essentially like the digital border that's being set up. Because like we were talking the other night, you were saying like people will be born into the system like the same way my generation and other generations were born into vaccines and having vaccines. It'll be just like and just part of their life. It'll be part of their coming to be, I guess. It's like built into the system. So I just wanted to, I guess, touch on that a little bit, like how you talk about the false self and the true self a lot over the years. And I guess like the whole Real ID thing is pretty much like solidifying the false ID, like a fusion with the false self and the true self, like a total misidentification. And it's kind of like mind over matter, because I remember you were saying that law, or I guess like documents, like agreements, contracts, is essentially like mind over matter in a sense, because it's like it's controlling your body. This agreement, this contract is controlling your physical experience. And it's essentially, I guess, mind over matter. And I guess wanted to get into that a little bit. What you see coming as far as dates and like the Real ID, and what we're facing here, and I guess the sense of urgency that we need to have for creating a more realer way of being.
Well, as you can see, based on what you just described, which is an excellent analogy, or description, mind over matter, because it is. Contracts are mind over matter. They get you to do something with your matter, with your vessel, based on what is written or what is said. And this too has been warned, that you don't want your world to become like, envision a Tokyo subway station where you don't have to do anything. Just stand there at rush hour near the door and just go with the flow. Then you don't have to hold on to anything, just walk and follow through. This is the nature of complacency. In the world of complacency, most people are going to be separated, and that's another thing. They don't want you. When I say they, I don't like using that word, but you are starting to see who the parasites are. For the most part, there's a lot that you haven't seen, but for the most part, you can see the so-called movers and shaker parasites. But they are nothing without all of the minion. You might be part of that minion. You might have relatives that are part of that minion. It might be your next door neighbor, or just might be you and all of the above. You might not agree with what happens. You may not like it at all. In fact, you might be one of the so-called protesters of it. But it means nothing if you are not actively doing something with those who are similarly minded around you and manifesting in the tangible form of community. Because you will otherwise be pushed along with the crowd into realms you don't want to be in. And this is just the start. As I mentioned, as Taylor mentioned, and I have talked about it, the so-called Real ID is just the beginning. It will be incorporated into, pardon the pun, a blockchain-like system. And this blockchain-like system will encompass everything, your so-called financial records, financial status, financial means, and of course, anything else that goes with it, from your sexual orientation to the gender that you have claimed. You have to claim your gender in this other real world. And once you claim it, you can't change it unless you have a doctor's note that says you've changed it. And then also your so-called health history. All of this associated with your so-called ID. And more than likely will change names, but the dates that are involved in this are all starting now, but culminating in the actual changeover or conversion in 2027, so-called 2027. Kind of like how they threw at you the whole digital changeover. That's one of those standards. The weights and measures standards. Well, you have standards in broadcasts, etc., and telecommunications. Well, these will all be tied in. It's already being tied in. No, it won't be perfect, and yes, it will be hackable. And that's done deliberately because the more something is breachable, the more regulations you can add to it. So it's all by design.
Yeah, and I guess
Do you want to go? No, you don't want to go there. Believe that. Know that, not believe that, but no, you don't want that to be. One of the saving graces that is available right now is if you are in a community, but if you're not, you will be caught up in it more than likely, and your children too. So for those who are going to plan families or offspring, I don't like the word children, but it ties into this whole system, but offspring, if you're going to have offspring, it behooves you to not only be against this whole so-called Real ID incorporation, but to plan for a route or an opt-out through action and situation so that you have a way to get out of it. Just moving out and saying you're going to live off grid in some country somewhere doesn't cut it. Obviously, no one escapes anything. You have people, so-called melanated people, thinking they can go anywhere in the world to escape so-called racism. No, everywhere you go, you're going to encounter racism. So stop trying to run from it. And the same thing applies to this. So you say, well, I'm going to, drop my straw man. There will be no dropping of the straw man. The straw man will be the facade, the complete facade. That's why I mentioned about true self years ago. The true self this is the destruction of true self. This will be complete facade. And you don't want that to be. And as I mentioned, for those who are preparing or plan to bring in offspring, you want to be able to, and not only able to, you want to make steps and tangible steps in manifesting a community, not going solo, literal community of like-minded individuals. And don't get caught up in all those other factors that have been winning for so long, such as race, etc. Just be wise based on things like the cultural mindset. As we talked about, again, there's a connection, as we talked about at the top or at the beginning. Be wary of who you let in who have cultural norms within. That's in the blood, in the sense, because they inculcate it with certain norms. So some things are into them, whether it's stealing to, be careful, I don't want to get anyone in trouble with so-called sexual assault, put it that way. Certain things are considered normal. People don't bat an eye to it because it's in their culture to see these things and no big deal. You don't want that in your community. So there's certain things, or the harming of young people, the harming of elderly people, the harming of anyone, male or female, not allowed. Safeguarding, defense, all of that allowed. But you have to set these things up based on what are true community standards, not a cult, not anything like that. Now, not the throwaway cult that actually is the baby in the bathwater. Because of the setup, and I'm referring to people who live in countries that have this in their constitution, because of the setup, and also because of its mercantile benefits, most countries are not going to go against religions unless they've already been have had issues with it deliberately. But in those countries where religions and religious practices are protected, that's going to be your saving grace for your community. You're going to set your community up as something ecumenical, and you're going to set it up correctly with the proper paperwork, and this is going to be the saving grace of your community and allow you to opt out of certain things like Real ID. can you participate in the functions of this real ID world, so-called real ID world? That's one of the reasons why autonomy and communal reliance have to be strengthened and made tangible. You might want to have those who are still plugged in. They can access things for the group. But when it comes to the main things, the mainstays and staples, you really don't want to have to rely on external sources. So for things like food, that should be a given. I mean, we've got who knows how many so-called epochs or time, over time, where that has been proven. You can grow anything anywhere. You just become complacent and lazy and used to an empire system that tells you otherwise. But you can grow anything anywhere, and you have to maintain it, and it does take work. And if you do it as a community, it's not as hard. But you can do that too. And you can still maintain your plug-in if you want to the empire and have your internet, etc. But there are more things that are of greater nature than all of that other stuff. And you'll find out as you move through this grid, this false grid.
From what I'm seeing, like, because we talked about it last time. You were saying that words are like keys, and I guess it's like the same thing with the contract that you have with yourself or with your false self. I think it's paramount to know one's true name, or I guess to have created or realized the true name, because how can you really even correctly identify with the true self if you still go by, like, you have the false self that has this government name, and then this thing just evolves into like a real ID that becomes like a two-dimensional avatar that is pretty much like the actual leader of your life at some point. So like knowing your actual name has to be like a key to yourself. And I was watching a video some years ago, maybe a couple years back, and it was talking about because like in the Bible they talk about Pharaoh all the time, and I was listening to this video, and this guy was saying that, or it might have been a woman, she was saying that Pharaoh isn't just one individual, it's actually like the name, I guess, the Aboriginals themselves, or it's people that's like more, I guess, the people that have the land grant at the time. I don't know. Is Pharaoh actually like a group of people, and then like you because like I know like your Facebook name is a different name, like it's like Ahaya Kanak, and I remember you were saying like Ahaya is like the real I am that I am. So I was wondering, like, is Pharaoh the people that you represent, and then Ahaya Kanak is the actual name? Like, is there a name that you have for yourself, and then like a name that you have for the world, and then you use them like as different keys for access to different things, like access to the world, access to yourself more. And if you have a false self, it's like a lock more than a key.
To answer that, I'll say this. The names that you have, and also the names that you see, for example, on that Facebook page, and the name, you are astute in your question, about what is Pharaoh, not necessarily just my name, but what does it mean in a sense? It is like a house. Think of the name Versace or Vittadini or one of these so-called Italian designers. That's a house. They call it a design house. And under that house, you have certain types of designs that fit within the regulation or the adherence to a particular look and frame, and not outside of that. It can grow, but it's a house. And in that house, you have all the people associated with it, from the seamstresses to the fabric makers, etc. All that within that house. But that's just it's a weak example of it. A school can be a house. For example, the old way of teaching martial arts was actually a lifestyle and a house. You went and you lived in the house of the teacher. And this house became like a temple to some. That is the closest to what you're answering your question. That is the house. So now you see the name Pharaoh's house.
Yeah, because you used to always start the podosodes off like, welcome to Pharaoh's house. Like, you're inside the inner chamber of Pharaoh's house. And I was always like, man,
right.
Is Pharaoh actually, is he like a consigliere for Pharaoh, like this overall Pharaoh? Like, that's actually a people or a house, like you said. And
it's a house.
Yeah.
Right. And you have a teacher in the house. And the teacher makes sure that everyone knows. That's the whole purpose of being within a house. You know what's up, in a sense. And no one comes through without knowing what's up. You have a choice to come in and out and not know. If it gets too deep or too heavy for you, you can exit. But for those who are part of that house, they recognize there's nothing too deep and nothing too heavy. They know what the purpose of being here is. And in the house, it's like being in a vessel or ship, or if you want to say a temple even. It's like being in a place where knowing and absorbing and learning are part of being here in this realm. You see this in certain so-called religions. For example, if you were to go to Tibet or so-called Tibet, you see a lot of the so-called monks in their cloisters and they're secluding away from the world in a sense, but if you notice, they reside in these houses. You think of the term house, or casa, for those who might know the word for it. You think of a place where a group of people are in a nuclear structure, supposed to be in a nuclear structure. But the house is more than just the building. The building provides protection from everything, from whatever, depending on what has been allowed in the culture, and of course what comes with the so-called weather. You know, if your culture has permitted and become weak, such things as robbery and theft, etc., then your house is a protection against that. If you are in an area that is seasonal or has harsh climate, then your house is protection from that. That's not cultural, but you will dress and it will become part of your culture. How you put on clothes, all that comes from within that house. So you have another house and another house and another house. You are similar in the things that you do, and that becomes the so-called culture and the cultural connection. But all of the houses are separate, but they are in some way, shape, or form close, or they have a connection, whether they're a few feet apart or miles apart. Usually there's a number that you don't want to exceed. You don't want to go too far, because now you defeated the whole purpose of having a house in a community. So you don't want to go too far from it. The purpose of being within a house is no different than the purpose of why you're in your so-called house, whether the house is an apartment or rental or something you allegedly own. I say that for a reason, and those who know why I say that. So that is a house. But in the truest sense, outside of the straw person, your house should be yours. You shouldn't be paying anything on that to anyone, because that's the nature of a house. You're not beholden to anyone else. Depending on what you're plugged into or connected to or committed to, you give up certain things about your house until the point where it's not your house. So in the sense of the name, your conduits, aka parents, informed on you, as the saying goes, and compromised what could have been your name. So your name becomes an asset to, not to you so much, it can be once you find out what's been going on. But in the meantime, it's an asset to the empire serving system or service, not so much to you. Therefore, it's breached or compromised. It's not a bad thing, but then what you have to do is get another name. Don't throw away your so-called straw person or compromised name. It's already there. It will be used whether you like it or not, or don't use it or not. use it as a public name like you would a business. It's your business name, your DBA. Use that name, but you have your name that is sacred, or as some say, private. That's not to be known by anyone other than those who have, mutual trust within a community. And a bank is not your community. Your job is not your community. So various things are not your community. A restaurant where you have to sign for something, that's not your community. But you wouldn't put that name on anything related to empire structures. There's very few things that you would put your name on.
Somebody asked, somebody had asked, like, how do you find out what your real name is, or how do you create a real name?
You wouldn't do that. You would get someone who has the true wisdom to know exactly how your name should fit you.
So it's kind of like when you come out of the streets, and it's like you gotta earn your name. It's not like you could just make your name up, kind of thing.
That fits.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, I guess it's similar to like Israel being a people or a house rather than being a physical location.
Correct.
Yeah. So
Correct.
I wanted to ask about because before we touched on the eukaryotes and the prokaryotes and the archaea, and I wanted to ask about anaerobes because from my experience, my life, like I guess certain things kind of had me in an unconscious connection with my breath, but my life significantly changed as I became consciously aware of my breath, and then took the steps to facilitate the breath or the experience of the breath to make it even a more amplified experience. So I wanted to ask, I guess, about like as far as like anaerobes, like are there some people that are like anaerobic archaea? Because like you have like things like archaea in the gut that are anaerobic that don't even breathe air and they can live without air. I guess they like, I've heard of some, they like convert carbon into methane and that's how they live, stuff like that. And I see it on a more macro level with people because I don't understand how people can be so disjointed from the breath. Like I look at it like how is this happening? Are they like an anaerobic, like personified fungus? Like who are the anaerobes?
I mean, if you want to say that, you would say that they could be hybrid, if you will. They're not, and that would be anyone. It doesn't have to be deliberate. They can be most. In this world, many of the things in an environment are meant to choke you off from your breathing, from true breathing, and from air, oxygen. You can control so much when you do that to a sentient, not only their longevity, you can control a lot of things. So in a sense, that would be most people are borderline hybrid anaerobic, where part of them is existing within a inner universe that has minimal oxygen. We see that a lot with quick cell demise that happens far greater than what it should. You have what they call, I think the term is obligate anaerobes, and they cannot exist where there's even minimum amount of oxygen. So when we see individuals that have a high emotional state, and at the same time they're constantly lashing out at someone else, but then the next moment they're attempting to befriend, that is a very obligate type anaerobic way of doing things. we need and require a lot of the micro minerals, microorganism, everything from the electron on up or on out. We require a lot of these different things, but you're not going to get this in certain species because that's just the nature of those species. However, in a sentient, what happens when these things are closed off on a cellular level? You get biochemical reactions. Those reactions often show up in behavior. They always do show up in behavior in some form, whether it's internalized or externalized, acted out on others or acted out on the cell. See, that's an excellent question because there are many types of anaerobes. That's a great study. I'd like to perhaps do a podisode on that to explain more about anaerobes. It's a world within itself. But just think of it in answer to your question that those types of individuals that you're referring to, they're probably more of a hybrid, a mix of the two, because no sentient and very few creatures exist in this particular realm without the use of oxygen, the need for oxygen.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to ask you. That's what I wanted to ask you about as far as like the I guess the other side of that spectrum is like because there says I looked online and it said that there's autotrophic anaerobes, and I was wondering like I guess there's an anaerobic function to a sentient. I guess maybe when they leave their body, their breath goes into or their spirit goes into a different state where they don't need oxygen, and they somehow are autotrophic in another, like in an anaerobic sense, I guess, like metaphysically or spiritually, they can somehow live or breathe after the body without oxygen. Like, is that part of the process of like so-called death?
You mean while they're alive?
No, I'm talking about once you die, or when so-called die, pass on. Do you go into a state as your consciousness? Are you going into like an anaerobic state where you no longer need air to breathe? Because like anaerobes can live or breathe without oxygen. So I was wondering if you could somehow, if you're an autotrophic anaerobe, or if you have that faculty, once you pass on, are you going into a state where you're breathing without air?
Well, your breathing so-called apparatus are not functioning. Really, when you go into those so-called transition states, the being, the vessel, if it were to be measured or gauged, would show no signs of respiration.
I get that.
So the need for...
I get that. I'm just saying, like, once you're leaving the body, is the consciousness breathing another way?
Is the consciousness breathing another way in the sense that it would require it? Because that's the only reason why we use oxygen now, but because we require it. So there would have to be a requirement for oxygen in this particular realm in between or after sentient life.
Yeah, that's what I'm asking. Is there a different...
If it exists in this realm, without going into some so-called dimension, then more than likely it has some usage for not just oxygen, but all the other so-called elements in some way, shape, or form. The manipulation of the elements occurs, allegedly, according to some true so-called parapsychologists and studies, paranormal studies, not the YouTube scholar or paranormal so-called specialist. But I mean, people who've actually put in time and study and received information in the form of grants, etc., to do more studies, true studies. Many of them have reported a manipulation of material or matter by something that wasn't there, or allegedly not there. So when you say not there, when I say not there, I mean not here. And anyone else would mean the same thing. Well, what is not here? If it's not here, then where is it? It would have to be here. So if it is here, it would have to have some effect or have the ability to affect an element. Not just to make itself known, but for some purpose. We don't take in elements to make ourselves known, although usually we do. We breathe so that we can interact. But just imagine something that would be called a so-called apparition or so-called spirit. What would be the need to make itself known? It would have to have a purpose still within this realm. And hence the reason why many have been warned, be careful, or just don't talk or play around with anything that is not in your realm. You'll have more than enough time to go and do that later. Okay, but right now don't, because the ability to see outside of self into those realms requires a lot of manipulation, usually with some type of synthetic or some type of organic plant or organic substance like ayahuasca, or even heavier than that. And even still, without knowing and having any management skills to do so within those realms, you're putting yourself at high risk. If you talking about anaerobes and elements, etc., within the world that we are in now, the so-called world we're in now, you have no control, allegedly, over the pathogens and antigens that can dwell anywhere. For example, certain parasites can dwell and remain on surfaces as certain viruses allegedly can, or can be, according to the so-called last pandemic, can be in the air, and so you need a mask to block it from getting into your breathing apparatus. All that, of course, is all. It's about legit as a YouTube paranormal investigator. But the same thing applies. If these microbes can affect you as a sentient in this realm, in the so-called conscious dimensional realm, then outside of this realm or alongside of this realm, more than likely there is something that can affect, with an A, the former tangible sentient, and at the same time can be affected by a former tangible sentient. This is just taking a logical step to the next thing, without getting into any type of religious input or occult input. Though, so there's supposedly some type of unwritten rules. The unseen cannot violate. And we know that that's kind of been disproven. And then, of course, there are supposedly rules that we, the sentients, are not to violate, or for our own benefit, which kind of makes more sense. If you're dealing with something you can't see, then you need to protect yourself. If you walk into a room with a certain type of tuberculosis or meningitis, the chances of contracting it are higher than if you don't go on those rooms or around people who have it, but you don't know who has it. Thirdly, when you are immersed in areas where these so-called microbes that are virulent can affect you, what stops them from affecting you? Well, obviously you have to have something built in. And what breaches that? So what would breach this realm to make itself known as a so-called spirit? Certain things would have to be done on this side to help it. No different than a so-called virus is helped in a lab.
I guess
that's why you would see people doing certain types of alchemical rituals, or what's the same thing in religions. They do a version of alchemical rituals, liturgies, from masses to, all of these are rituals that involve some type of element, whether it's water, whether it's whatever, especially Catholicism. And again, no, this is a disclaimer to any one of these religions. This is not casting aspersion on your religion. It's just pointing out what is obvious. But these are all manipulation of elements in order to what? To affect some type, or either be affected or to affect, or both, these various realms, the seen and the unseen.
And that's why I was asking, like, I guess, like, because you, like, well, what you were saying about being affected by the unseen, it's like how you can bait a fish to a hook, and the fish lives in water. Like, does the fish even see water? Like, the same way, like, we don't see air. You know, most people, I guess, don't see the photons or anything, or the makeup of the air. So is it like the same thing? Like, we're being baited by something that can, you know, like, kind of fish us the same way we people reel in fish. They drop a bait in. The fish are in a realm or in a chemical setup that they're suspended in, I guess you could say, and then they can get manipulated by something that's in I guess a more less dense ocean. And then I guess beyond that, is there something that's kind of like fishing that, you know, above us, that's even in another state of being that's even more unseen to most people's eye, like, and that's how, I guess, like, you can't really, I mean, I guess you could catch a fish without bait, but for the most part, the fish has to kind of consent to being caught, like, through getting baited. And I was wondering if it's like the same kind of situation with the unseen, or like you were saying, like, things or entities that can violate or come into this experience. Like,
in short, so they don't endanger anyone or anything else, you have to. There's a world of overlapping, if that way, or worlds of overlapping. Using your example of, or analogy of fish. Fish exists in an overlapping realm just like we do. So a fish, so-called fish, can be swimming in a school or swimming solo and might swim upon an area that is known for fishing and netting, you know, where they just grab up a bunch of fish in a net. Did that fish make a conscious choice to get caught? It made a so-called cognizant, if you will, choice to go into an area that may be just the area that it goes through, its path, its stream, because this is where it gets food. And it might be following others, or it might just have it built within its experience, passed down through it from its others, its progenitors. So it's just going through an area that it knows. That would mean that those above, the so-called fisher people, would have to know this. They know that these types of fish, let's say tuna, come through this area. So this is where we're going to cast our nets. This is where we're going to do a lot of catching of fish. Are they going to catch a particular fish? Well, now they've got technology to add trackers to fish. They can shoot it from above or put it in bait. Fish will eat it. They'll now have a tracker that they know that this particular fish is a so-called social fish. It swims in school, so they will follow that tracker, and that they know that that tracker is usually a school of 10 to 100 or more perfect. So now they can just wait in waiting and capture something. So yeah, you can say that this might go on both sides. I think this in an allegorical sense, was mentioned in the Septuagint, a so-called New Testament, when the character name or the individual name Jesus said that he's a fisher of men. So it's one thing to catch a fish. How do you catch a sentient? You have to put the bait out there. And, you know, what's the bait? This is done on various levels, on all levels, not just the seen and the unseen, most of it being unseen, you know, when you're dealing with mind over matter. And people who are in marketing do it. Advertisers do it. people who just want to influencers do it. So there's a lot of it going on all levels. And obviously, there are going to be other sources, other energy extracting sources that are going to be on the sidelines, getting what they can get. No different than the little fish, I forget what they're called, but they have a name, that ride along with large predators and help them by keeping them clean or eating the overflow sediment or sinew from the kills that these large predators get. So when you do something on a level that's bringing in a lot, there will be something on the sidelines. This is done in the world of finance. There's always something on the side, getting the little bit in the aggregate, staying fed. This is the world we're in. Excellent analogy of the underwater and the above water, and we're all underwater in some form. We're within a firmament, so we're all within some type of sea.
So I guess that brings me to kind of ties back. I want to go back in a little bit as far as like people have their true name, or they realize a true name through an elder or what have you, and it's like a key to themselves. But we were talking the other night about how you have certain names that are allowed, like Khazars or Scythian, or whatever the name that they have sanctioned. What is the actual name of this personified adversary? Like the true name.
This personified. You broke up for a second or two. Could you repeat that?
I was saying, what is the name of like the personified adversary?
Avatar? Did you say avatar?
Adversary, like basically Satan, Shaitan.
Okay. There's many names, obviously, because it behooves it to have many names so that you cannot identify it. When you think of a name, for example, the name of the originator creator, you would ask yourself, why would you need a name if it's only you? That's one. It's just using logic. So again, keep the emotions parked outside or put them in a room with some crayons or markers or whatever, or a book, whatever you want. This is in your world, in your imagination. So do the smart thing with the emotions. Logically speaking, if you have a name and you are the manifesting architect, if you will, of everything, from the unseen to the seen, so that means there's no iota missing, then why would you need a name unless the name is necessary for those you want to communicate with or need to communicate with you, and therefore you would have to have some way for invoking to function. Remember, we talked about invoking previously versus prayer. But in order to invoke, just based on the word itself, you have to have a name, an exact name. Otherwise, it's like I'm going to call your house, but I'm going to call 555-1212. Will I eventually get you? Go by probability and random. I doubt it. And no matter how, like the spin of the dice, it's beyond the dice or beyond a roulette wheel. There's just no way. It would have to take some type of intervention. If you can be here for 10 billion years and everyone else for 10 billion years, it would take more than just one number to reach you. It wouldn't work. So I can dial 555-1212 from here to so-called eternity. I wouldn't get you. You would have to tap into that number. What reason would you have to? You would have to find out that, oh, wow, all these people have been calling 555-1212 all these years. Let me disconnect this number. Let me just tell them, I'll send out a prophet and let them know 555-1212 Empire 5000 is not the number. Don't call. You're not going to get me. Okay, here's my number. And this is my only number. If I'm not there, leave a message. That hasn't happened. Well, to a degree it hasn't happened. You've had prophets that have experiences, and in those experiences, they have met adversaries, and they have like so-called angels, and they have usually met angels. Very few people are actually reading. Very few have actually talked with or met with the countenance, not the counsel, but the countenance of the originator creator. When you come in contact with almost face to face. Each has come in contact with a representation of, but not the. So the representation was a message or an actual, like a rune or symbol. And within that was a paradox, like I mentioned before about the burning matter that didn't burn. Being one example of it.
So it's like kind of the same thing. It's the same thing, kind of like there's really no. The name for the creator originator is, I guess, kind of ineffable. It's something similar like that for like the specific or accurate name of the adversary and the people that represent that, like, because this name must be outlawed almost the same way that the so-called Jews call Yad-Heh-Vah-Heh, they call that Hashem instead of saying the name. So is it the same thing with the other side of the spectrum where you have this adversarial entity that they don't want you to know the name of this, and they don't want you to know the name of the representatives. So you got all these misnomers where you call them Jews, you call them Khazars, you call them Scythians, you call them whatever you call them. Like what would you call these manifestations, and like what is the accurate name, I guess, for either one of the sides?
You mean in terms of this particular groups or factions of people who claim to be of a particular religion? Mind you, it's a religion, but they're not claimed. Most of them do not claim, but they have been inculcated into accepting their culture, accepting what has been taught to them, and that would be that they come from a particular bloodline. So logically, those who are allegedly not of the same bloodline should look at it in terms of how we are to look at all religions. If I walked into a Buddhist country, a country where they practice Buddhism, and said, I want to become a Buddhist, will they stop me? Will they tell me, you don't have slanted eyes, so you can't be Buddhist? What they're doing is no different than if I walked into Norway and said, hey, I'm white too. So now what has been happening, not only with so-called religions and also so-called race, is this homogenizing of something that is not supposed to be homogenous. So anybody can be white, anybody can be black, anybody can be a Jew, anybody can be a Catholic, but at the same time what has happened is this factioning. So you've got factions that say, okay, yeah, you can be a Jew, but you're a convert. We're the original, which is false. Like, who's the original Catholics? Okay, because if you're the original Jew, then who's the original Catholics? Who's the original Muslims? Some will say, the original Muslims go back to Ishmael, okay, which is not technically true completely. But this is all false. This is a way to just bring oneself into a particular group and separate self and others in a factionalized world. This is clan mentality. and I'm not speaking of Ku Klux Klan, I'm talking clan mentality that came out of various parts of the realm where life was very, very cutthroat.
What is the difference between a clan and a bloodline?
A clan can be a bloodline. A clan is usually increased by force. But it starts off usually with one group of people, two so-called families, and in order to increase that size, you do whatever you have to, whether it be steal males and raise them, steal women and sexually forcibly sexually impregnate them. So these are various ways to increase clan numbers, and that's what was done by these particular bloodlines that were of clans, like the Yanaya people, for example. I mentioned them. The so-called Khazars, which started out black and then now they're not. That's how they all became the same thing with so-called Caucasians. They started out black and now they're not. But they started out the same way, and what they did was they did the same thing, just bringing in everyone to increase their size, because you're talking about warlike people. Very warlike, very aggressive, take someone else's land if you don't have enough to feed your people. That goes against the land grants, the so-called divine land grants that, this is for this group, this is for this group, and this is for this group, which makes sense in a sense. But if you're in an area that's kind of barren half of the year, well, as they say, that's terrible for you, but then does that give you the right to encroach and invade on your cousin or your neighbor or your brother or even just a stranger? No, it does not. But that's what clans do. So clans take over and become nations.
So are the Tartars Khazarian?
What they call Tartar, if you actually looked at some of the writings about Tartarians, no, they weren't Khazarian, but keep in mind, don't look at what you were taught today about Khazarians. Khazarians are actually so-called black people. Literally, they were black people. Big afros, I think is what they had on their head, and then later on, they would use big animal skins to emulate or simulate the so-called hair that they did not have, big afro. But these started off one way and then they became another. No different than what you found in the so-called Levant, of groups that were one way and then after less than 100 years, they now something else.
That's what I wanted to ask.
In origins, a lot of them are Turkic. Syrians, same thing. Syrians were not what you see today.
The Mamluks. The Mamluks was those are the slaves that took the area over.
Exactly.
I mean, that's mainstream history. People should know that. Like when they look at a Saudi or Egyptian.
Mm-hmm, same thing. You can go to these areas and see the actual original people still there, but pushed off to the side. No different if you go to Mexico, you see the same thing. They're pushed off to the side with the same narrative. Oh, they're slaves. They came here from, they were shipped here, they were brought here. Everywhere on the realm, from India to Mexico to Saudi Arabia to Egypt, come on, that's one of the biggest lies. Though, one thing that fits with it is the fact that Shemites, or the house of so-called Israel, would be spread like grains of sand around the world.
Yeah, that's throughout the text. That's throughout the text that they scattered as a remnant for one vain reason or another that they decided to commit to. But I wanted to ask you about the fall of Edom, because I've looked into like the Punic Wars, and it just dawned on me that they called Punic just meant Phoenician.
Correct.
So Edom was taken over by the Phoenicians, or was attacked repeatedly by the Phoenicians, which is Canaan.
Phoenicians, they're a mix of groups. A lot of these these ancient peoples that they write about in these history volumes in passing. There are some writers that you really have to get a hold of what they've written, and those are sequestered in museums like so-called Herodotus. He had access to materials from before him and during his time, his contemporary times. So he would be an excellent source if you can get, it pays to read Latin. But he will be one source. There are other sources as well. And they mention these different groups that were mixed deliberately so that they can improve or increase their strength and their wealth. No different than what you saw here in the so-called U.S. states, in the so-called Indian nations and tribes, when some were overrun and there were just all the males were wiped out for the most part. The women and children, as opposed to being enslaved, would run and get in with another nation or be absorbed to another nation. Often, with the so-called Aboriginal Negro, it wasn't a matter of just running into one unless they were friendly with another group. Sometimes they were automatically enslaved by other so-called Indian groups. And when I say this, I'm not just referring to the Han hybrid, so-called Mongol groups. I'm talking about the so-called Negro groups that were already here. They did a lot of enslaving of their own. And they also bought slaves that were shipped in from Europe. Most of the ones shipped in from Europe were Slavic, so-called Serbian, Yugoslavian, so-called Celtic. That was later on after, because you know what happened in Ireland. They wiped out the Negroes of Ireland and then they replaced them. But many of them were just used as slaves by the English, not British. And so you had this slave system around the so-called world, not globe, around the world. And many of the slaves were so-called, most of them actually, were what you would call or classify as white today.
Yeah, just like we were talking about how Shem was scattered throughout the nations, like such as Babylon or different nations, and reduced to a remnant. I was reading Obadiah, the prophet Obadiah, and it was saying that at the end, Israel was they took over the remnant of Edom. And so I guess for whatever reason, the laws of this place, you cannot completely wipe out whoever the adversary is. They have some sort of sanction to exist to some level, at least to a remnant.
There's a reason for that, I'm sure, to have some remnant. But for example, if you look at so-called China or Shinnah, and if you look at it on the surface, you look at all publications and sanctioned media from the 30s, so-called 1930s, on up to today, you will only see, well, maybe not then, if you were looking at, for example, that magazine called National Geographic, which is a secret society, by the way. But if you looked at some of the photos that they would show from their quote-unquote explorers, you'd see this group that looks like so-called black people, but they're just Asian looking. They kind of have that Kalahari, Khoisan look. They're not as light skin or brown skin. They're actually very, very dark. And this wasn't because this is black and white photography. Often you would see color shots as well, too. That was one of the reasons, the highlights of National Geographic back then, the colorization of certain photographs. And you would see these people and wait, if you were looking at it today, you would say, wait, what are these people doing here? But back then, it was considered the norm. You would see it in a lot of the literature in the so-called European nations or Western nations. When they would write about these countries, their writers would write such things as, dark China, swarthy Chinese. They're saying that these people were black skinned. And that's how they looked at them. It wasn't until they started, making these agreements, around the turn of the century with China and these trade agreements or for gold, etc., that they became accepted as quasi-white, quasi-Caucasoid, or quasi-Occidental. And that's why you see today, they've got Chinatowns everywhere, and even you started to see this in the early part of the 20th century. If you looked into pop culture, the acceptance of Chinese into so-called white societies, you didn't see anyone else being accepted on that level. You definitely didn't see so-called Negroes accepted like that.
In Brazil,
you definitely didn't see anyone like that. And exactly, in Brazil, the heart of a casta. You didn't see that happening there.
Because in Brazil, when I was in
Brazil, it's like a miniature China. If you go to Brazil, and most of the places there, from Santa Catarina all the way up until you get to the northeast of Paraíba, most of the places there have been homogenized. They've wiped out the original groups. A lot of them replaced with so-called mainland Africans. There's a lot of trading going off back and forth from there, not on the millions scale like they tell you those lies about the so-called transatlantic slave trade being in the millions. Just do the math on that. It makes no sense. The ships, the trees, the minimum amount of trees to build these things, stop. They want you to accept a bill of goods, no pun intended, and it's seriously a lie. And the same people behind that are the same people behind a lot of lies that have been accepted and misused for profit and subjugation of groups.
When I was in Brazil, they were saying that the biggest concentration of Japanese people outside of Japan is in Sao Paulo, because they didn't want slavery, because slavery ended in Brazil later than anywhere else on earth, supposedly like 1890 or something, supposedly. So what I was told was that they didn't want to give the so-called slaves jobs to have any type of footing in the society, so they just imported Japanese, because Japanese, I guess, were more pale and more, I guess, like them. Cause, like, ultimately, like you said, with the Canaanites, you never really know who's a cousin, because the faces could be different, but they're still all just, they're all just different sons of Canaan.
Exactly. So that was one of the reasons why they issued the Lei Aurea, the so-called Golden Law, was so that they could bring in so-called not only Japanese but Filipinos. They had been bringing in Filipinos into that region and on up into Central America for years. Central America for a longer time than in Brazil. So you have a lot of so-called Native Americans, actually so-called Filipinos or Chinos, and they have no connection whatsoever to the actual original people of the so-called Americas. And in Brazil and in Peru, you have a large Japanese population. You'll see it instantly, and many still speak Japanese and Portuguese. And if you go to places in Peru, for example, even the very remote places like Iquitos, you'll find Chinese street signs and people speaking Chinese and Spanish, and they've been there for at least the last 150 years or more, because of the fact that they were brought in as a result of, the killing off of a lot of the Aboriginal males, and then of course the mixing with the Aboriginal females. You get this mixed group that you see today. They have dark skin, slanted eyes, straight hair.
I've heard that.
This is the mestizo, so-called mestizo, and it's a part of a caste system. So you've got they brought in Africans, so-called Africans too, primarily from places like Senegal and from not so much from Nigeria, but from Ghana, places like or Songhai. They brought in a lot of people. Then all the way up until 1888, they were bringing in some Africans, not to the degree or to the level that these history books claim, but they brought them in for the purposes of mating to wipe out the Aboriginal male line. Same thing they tried to do in North America, but it didn't work because there weren't a lot of Africans there. And yes, like that Italian director made in his movie, what was it, Goodbye? I forget the name of it. It came out in the 70s. In that movie, he exaggerated it, of course, but they had what were called sexual assault farms. But it wasn't a farm, it was just a house, like a brothel. and they would kidnap 3 Aboriginal females from 12, childbearing age on up to maybe around early 20s, and they would have Africans rape them. So this would now bring the African seed in, and the child they would have as a slave. The main thing was to get rid of the Aboriginal male line.
Yeah, I've heard that Japanese. I don't know. I'm not familiar with it, but I've heard that Japanese is similar to Mayan, and I was always wondering, is the Mayan culture like a usurpation of what was there? Like, I don't know if the Olmecs were there first, or who the original Aboriginals of the area were, but I've heard that Japanese is similar to Mayan, and I just didn't know. I know you know languages.
You will find Mayan language in many languages, or words in many different languages around the world, from Egypt to Japan, not because they came here to the Americas, but because the influence of the Mayans, so-called Mayans, then you see them all over. Even in India, you'll see the signs and symbols that connect to the Mayan language, Mayan culture. Why? Because these were the great teachers.
I mean,
you see from the pyramids to some of the same deities that were translated into their own deities for their own purposes and their own culture. But you see a lot of that, and even food trade. A lot of the foodstuffs that were endemic to or native to the Americas, grown in various places around the world. So the Americas are the actual original plane or places for original people. These are the oldest lands. The next oldest lands, you can say this is Shen land. The next oldest land would be Asia, and then the next oldest lands would be Africa, Eurasia, in that order.
So, because I've seen they got Paleo Hebrew stones in New Mexico outside of Albuquerque and stuff like that. It always pops up, but they always say oh, this isn't real. This is a fake. This is a mimic. But it's for the years that this would have happened, when they supposedly dated, it doesn't really add up. So the timelines are always skewed, and they always hit it with this 70,000 years old, or this is however many years old. And I guess I just want to know, because you were talking about how this is the 5th level of creation, I guess, or I don't know if I don't know how you meant that, but I don't know if you meant it there's been 5 resets, or I don't know exactly what you meant by it, but I kind of just wanted to ask you about how many resets have there been, natural ones by the originator, and how many and are the world wars?
They've all been initiated by originator, creator, originator. So there have been 4. So I guess this would be the 5th, after this. So there have been 4 recreations.
So, and when this happens, there's some sort of repopulation that I guess unfolds of the true native or the true Aboriginal, and for whatever reason, there's a remnant left of Edom or of the adversarial entity or whatever, or the clones, what have you, and they get to respawn. So you have my analogy was you got different Terminators. Arnold Schwarzenegger was the first Terminator. Then you had the liquid metal Terminator. And it keeps evolving into the AI Terminator eventually. And
what did it need at the very beginning? If you read the books and look at the scripts rather, not so much the books. I actually had not all of them, just 2 of the scripts I got from a friend. And what you can glean from both the scripts and I guess the movies as well is that the origins of the so-called Terminator are actually in the form of something that's intangible, symbolic even, and like a code, if you will, or circuit board. And from that alone, all one would need would be to build up from that. And you can say that is how I wouldn't call so-called Edom the adversary. They can be an adversary, but they're not the adversary. So this adversarial seed or this adversarial parasite nuclei, or if it's not nuclei, archaei, where it's just material, genetic material. It can be laid out in runic form. It can be laid out in symbols. And all one would have to do with the symbols is either recreate the elements, get all the elements together and manifest what's necessary and put it into a life form. And then from there, either ingest the life form or get it into the bloodstream, no differently than what you see today in all of the so-called genetic experimentation. The danger, as I mentioned before, of empires is vanity. It's that goes with the territory, that you are the quintessential of everything, of intelligence. You are the hilt and the height of wisdom, and that's false. The fact that there's always this seeking to go outside self in an empire. Certain groups want to go to so-called space. Other groups want to have a resurgence of Atlantis, or find Atlantis. As if to say there is something, and there were these places that were of a higher intelligence. They admit that. So if they're of a higher intelligence than what you have now, it's not a highest intelligence. It's just a copy of. It's a facsimile. So all of these things, these so-called genetic experimentations, these colliders to find so-called God particles, et cetera, and all that stuff, they're not new. And one thing that no one wants to get into their head is that this was going on before, the manipulation, and I mean, it literally was going on before to a degree that would pale, these days would pale in comparison. Literally making some clone of self because you just wanted another you, even if it got, armed, you didn't care. And it was okay. It was acceptable in certain societies. Other things would be, you could literally design your offspring to get them to be exactly what you want them to be. Other things would include making armies, cloned armies. So now you have protection. They might look a little like you, but they have one thing in common, more important than your looks. They want to protect you and do your bidding because it's programmed into them. And no one wants to face these facts. And the fact that you have a lot of people carrying around the so-called mutant gene, that mutant gene was manufactured. And one of the ways to not look like everyone else is to make it pale. So that's why pale people were the first ones to be in, well, not maybe the first, but they were the best kind of slaves because you could easily spot them. They didn't have a long lifespan. They were, depending on how they were made, they were not made to be too brilliant or last too long, especially the males. And then as so-called time went forward, people were doing a lot of things with them. Some people were mating with them and they weren't supposed to. And this would bring about the so-called hybrid. Others were teaching them all of the things that they shouldn't have been taught because they didn't know what to do with them. And this is how you get what you got today. But this is nothing new. As there's the old adage goes, nothing new under the sun. Literally, nothing new under the sun.
That's why
to say that there is faulty.
That's why I was asking, as far as like the different levels or different recreations, the different resets. Like, if there's remnants each time, like looking into the orphan trains and the orphan asylums, you had like different echelons of orphans, and like one generation of clone or orphan would know a certain amount of information, and then he would only teach the next generation, but so much, and then it would be just less and less and less, and then it'd be like a totally oblivious cloned orphan. And I was just wondering, through all these recreations or these resets, if you had these remnants of clones that made it through as a remnant, and they had certain information, and then they crossbreed with like the new Terminator, and then it's like a hodgepodge of all these Terminators, kind of like amalgamation of Terminators, and like in the Terminator concept, it's like this thing goes back in time and is attempting to alter history to kind of like write in a new timeline or a fake history, and like you can look at it like how we look at the way the pale face has injected themselves in history in places where they were not, whether it be through different types of architecture or different generations of excellence throughout the world. It's like they grafted themselves. They somehow got access to time, and I guess it's a colonization. I'm assuming like a colonization of dreaming, of the dreamscape, I guess, where they can somehow inject themselves in their face in time, like kind of like a Mandela effect, where not like it's like if the Terminator successfully went back and killed John Connors when he was a kid and then assumed his identity. So I know it's a lot.
It doesn't take much to alter so-called timing and time. You can do that through a book and then have that book published and make it mandatory reading material for children. So you can manifest time changes and etc. as you mentioned through a book. You can do it definitely through a religion. So you don't have to have any kind of special machinery. And as you know from pop culture, and not only pop culture, so-called modern science, you can find something in amber, isolated so-called genes, and then place it into a receptacle, a living receptacle, and then manifest that same creature through the surrogate. It's already been done. What was it done with? It was just done recently with some so-called extinct creature that's now no longer extinct. And according to this article,
the wolf, right?
Which you can, right, exactly. The next in line is a so-called woolly mammoth. No, the next in line is to attempt to manifest maybe that adversary you were talking about.
Because there's no natural means to bring them back.
Well, there's only one way to get into this plane as a sentient, and that's through the penis of a man and out the vagina or out the uterus of a female. You're not getting in there any other way. You can bypass the male, but you're not bypassing that female.
Let's talk about that.
That's the only way in.
Let's talk about that, because we were speaking the other night about because I know some people might even be familiar with this that are listening. But some people say that Lilith was Adam's first wife. I know it's metaphorical, but like I've heard that Lilith is Adam's first wife, and that Lilith somehow is the first one to leave the Garden of Eden, and then Lilith is like this energy that like demands, like I guess the sacrifice of seed and abortion. And you were telling me that Lilith is actually like kind of like the Black Madonna almost, where it's like this is the epicenter of parthenogenesis, and that's how these clone clans are manifested, through that portal.
Yeah, which would make Jesus a female.
So, and that's why you were saying that the whole Jesus thing is really big amongst the clones or people that have been hybridized with clones, because this is something that's like kind of like a fallen angel that is coming not through a line, like an heirloom seed line
without the male line. You can't come through here without being, you need a father. That's just a given for all of those who are intersectional, et cetera, and against so-called binary. I guess that's the term. That's just, you got to use some logic when you speaking like this. But I don't get into arguments or discussions on that because it's illogical and it doesn't make sense to try to mix the two. But you have to come through a father, and especially males, they have to come through a father. Males contain both. They have the so-called X and the so-called Y. I'll go into the names in another time. They just say X and Y because they look like an X and a Y, but there's another name for them, both. But in any case, you have to have both as the male line, and that male line will determine both. That male line will determine whether female or male But if you're going to use that so-called parthenogenesis, and this ties back into a question you asked earlier about the anaerobic subject. If you're going to create a clone, it would have to be placed into the female, and that clone is not going to be a male. That's going to be another female. You saw that in these books, or movies rather, Jurassic Park. Those are females, if you recall. Think back, and it'll come to you that all of those animals were female.
It's just like weed. It's just like when you clone cannabis, you're just chopping off parts of the mother and then grafting that into the ground.
And you are creating what is called an adversary plant. So you want to know the ultimate adversary? There you have it. It's not Shaitan, it's not all these names. Well, Lucifer, allegedly, was the most beautiful angel. We don't usually describe males as beautiful. We describe female energy as beautiful. So Lucifer being a so-called light bearer, there's a secret encoding in that. And of course, in the iconoclasm that went throughout the so-called centuries, no props to Romans or Edomites, but throughout the centuries, so-called centuries, was to convert energy into a masculine form, a physical form, in the statue form, because this was the epitome of prowess and protection and strength for a nation, and so people would look up to that. So the female might have been hidden or placed on the side, like a support. In some instances, if it came from like their Canaanite cousins that remained in so-called Africa or in Europe even, or those that even came to the Americas and invaded. I'm referring to the so-called black ones, or so-called Negro originals. They are very matriarchal. So they were the ones who established this type of practice in art. They would, but they didn't do so in a so-called patriarchal way. That came later through these other groups, and that's why I call it iconoclasm, because it was a direct contradiction to the so-called matriarch. So the so-called pale races, so-called races, and pale slaves, former slaves, they designed their art to be more effeminate. And this was against their former masters, the so-called black groups, or so-called Canaanite groups. They were also enslaved by so-called some of the Shemites too, as well, but mainly by Canaanite, so-called Canaanites. They were a lot of the enslavers. Even the so-called the people you see today who are hybrids of all of them, they can trace their bloodlines back to enslavers who were enslaving so-called Irish, slaving, Croatians, etc., and just selling them, back and forth, and mating with them, obviously with the females, obviously, not the males. The males had a lifespan, they worked them to death, and that was the norm. But the females, they could be kept around. In the Turks and even some of the former Persians, this is where you get the harem system from, bringing females into our so-called harem and mating with them. So you have this whole, a nation within one compound. They would do this a lot. So the patriarch could be an original Arab, jet black. That's jet means kind of redundant, but jet black, and then his house would be a mix. You would have some albino-looking ones. You would have the stabilized genetic ones that would be the ones that hair could turn brown, eyes could turn brown, but they'd still be related to the albino one. Then some that had so-called non-Levant-looking features, that would be the slanted-eyed female, and they would have all these various mixes of females. From them, they could have their cousins and sons select wives. And from there, you'd have this huge nation of mixes and different complexions, hair textures, straight to curly to tight, etc., all through, and it's all one household.
Take it back to...
It hasn't stopped. It's still done today. People still do this today. Yeah. But it was done with a different perspective then. literally, almost religiously. It wasn't kept as a big secret.
I mean, I guess that's what I mean. You go to Brazil, you go to Egypt. It's kind of the same thing. They just speak in Arabic or they speak Portuguese, but it's the same. It's such a hodgepodge of things. But like to take it back to what you were saying about the feminine, the femdom thing. I guess that's why the people that promote the theory of evolution, they say that the original humanoid the name was Lucy, and then you have the so-called Jews of today. They say like you're not a Jew unless your mom is a Jew, and when originally it was all patriarchal. At least that's how the text is
It wasn't. You weren't from the line of someone through your mother. You were from the line of someone through your father. So that another is a telltale sign that certain groups are not who they say they are, just by looking at tradition. And also, again, the hybrid groups is not just to pinpoint one particular group, but the hybrid groups or the mutant groups or the manufactured groups. Let's just call it what it is. These are manufactured people. And that's one thing that is very hard to accept, and it's definitely not put into any record other than perhaps some abstracts. These genetic markers you see to this day are a sign of manufacturing.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you do things in the natural way through sexual intercourse. But these are actually done in temples and what we would call labs today, literally mating things to manufacture a world of Dr. Moreau, not an island of Dr. Moreau. And yes, they were doing things with strange creatures too. You see this manifested in art. And often it was done with a purpose, obviously the purpose being either, like to weaponize a being, turn it into, you need soldiers. You usually didn't have enough males in a so-called society. After a war, it took a certain amount of time to replenish that. Well, now if you can get someone who can make them, and you just raise them up, indoctrinate them, you've got a great fighting force. You've got and a mixed one too, but they might all look different. That's to your advantage. So all these things are going on, and it's hidden. You're given this so-called romanticized, and there's a key in that too. You're given this romanticized view of the so-called past in the form of history, as opposed to, even if you didn't do any kind of in-depth study, just being logical about it and saying, oh, wait a minute, I know that this is not the beginnings, this time that we are in so-called time, where these are not the beginnings of this type of behavior or these types of actions. They had to have been going on prior to. You mean the intellectuality stopped in architecture? There are buildings that architects admittedly today say cannot be replicated because they just don't know how to. But they don't have the machinery or the so-called manpower to make them. So in other words, the intelligence stopped at buildings, at structures, stopped at this madness. The intelligence was way beyond what you see today. So that tells you that, yes, remnants came and went, and so did so-called societal structures and things that went with it as a result of not just cataclysms, but, war, and, what comes with war is taking advantage of losing groups and making sure people, not only losing groups, but your own people, stay within a realm of so-called, I wouldn't call it ignorance, but stupidity.
Yeah, and a certain level of hunger and a certain type of hunger. I think, the connection there, I guess, is pretty funny, or is ironic, or just is what it is. Like Lucifer is commonly referred to as Venus, and Venus is the morning star. So that is Jesus. Oh, that's like the alter ego, right? I mean, that is the. The same thing. Yeah. So I mean, when you're made of this Lilith line, you essentially have no father because you're of the mother. It's kind of like the Jersey Devil. Like we were talking about the Jersey Devil and how this is a thing that came out of a woman's womb, but it was like another creature. It was not. It's like a mix. Maybe it might have a connection to the Aboriginal through the Aboriginal woman, if the woman's being raped or something and being forced to conduct this experiment or this induction. But I was wondering, like, I think you put it really well, because you were saying, like, that if you don't have a connection to the father, the ultimate father, because you don't have a father, because you're coming from this Lilith seed line, and so you're not really a man. You're just a feminized male. But even if you do come out with a penis, you're not really what man is. You're not Adam or Adam. You are something else. Hello? Can you hear me? Damn. Do you hear me?
Okay, well, yeah, now I can. It went out for a bit.
Oh no, I was just saying, like, if you're coming from the Lilith seed line, you're like a feminine. Even if you come out with a penis, you're just a feminized male. Like, you're not a man. You're not Adam. You're not Adam. You're not what the Bible would call man. You're something that's not man. Man is, like you said, it encompasses men and women. But if you come out of the Lilith seed line, whether you have a penis or not, you're a feminized male. Like, you're a male. It's not the same thing as a man.
Right, that could be, and then, pardon me, and then that would mean that all of the negatives or toxic aspects of femininity, and everything can have a toxic side, not just femininity. Anything can have toxins. But the so-called toxic side of femininity, which would be materialism, wanting things is not negative. A female would want things naturally because she's going to be the one, if she does bear offspring, she'll be feeding these young beings, these young sentients, and also having to clothe them, etc., etc. So yes, a female has a tendency or a desire or a natural way to want things for the house and those in the house. Take this and magnify it or amplify it to a perverted level, and this is what you see in the world today, run by what most would say are primarily, but not totally, but primarily the people you were mentioning, the mutant side, the pale side. And you see a lot of this going on with the taking of lands, warring, etc. That's very feminine, although you're taught that that's very masculine. That's not masculine. A man does not want to steal what another man has, and especially if that's not within his culture. If it's the true culture of Shaman, he's abiding by the law, he knows not to covet that which is not his. Whether that be someone's wife or the house that the other dwells in. You just don't do it. It's in you not to. But then there are those who are in this world. They might look pale, they might look dark, they might look in between, and they'll covet in a heartbeat and take if they can. So you see a lot of that going around.
The natural logic, like there's a comedian named Patrice O'Neal, and he was always talking about like how a man he wants to provide. It would sicken a woman to do those things for a man. It would be more so he'd be like a boy or a son, and it's more so the natural order of a man to want to be able to provide those things. He doesn't want the material himself. He wants to be able to provide it for his the mother of his children and his people, I guess. And so it's not more so for his self. And
correct.
Yeah.
If you listen to virtuous men speak, they, regardless of so-called color or so-called race, when they speak in terms of all. They're not saying, oh, this is just for men. But if you listen to women talk, and this is not for all those women speaking, and they can verify it by actually saying, hey, this is correct. When females speak, they have a tendency to partially speak for all, but then they come right back to what? Self and those who have a vagina too, especially under this spirit of so-called feminism. And it's a spirit, it's a program. So they'll constantly pinpoint, the difference and say, oh, and women and women and women and women. You hear that constantly. Just the other day, no different than any other day, there was a report, happened to have a radio broadcast on, and they just had to mention the fact that women and children were the number one victims in a particular incident. But I thought, well, wait a minute. I know it couldn't have been just women and children. There had to be some males in there too, adults and children, boys, etc. But they didn't mention them, but they had to highlight that women and children were amongst the casualties. In that itself, just the fact that you put women first and children last shows you the selfishness within. It should be children and women, because if children are the future, and children are what both people in all societies are supposed to be focused on as far as gearing up for the future and being the future, then you wouldn't want to, in your wording and your language, put children last. You would put them first. But women put themselves first, and you hear this in the lexicon, women and children, as if a male can bounce a bullet off, or even worse, that a male is supposed to succumb to violence. He's supposed to be the one, no matter what. So we don't need to bring it up in our reporting of anything, whether it's a storm or a war. Who cares? That's what you're made for. You're made to die for women and children, or women and maybe children. Because if you see, when things happen in skirmishes and wars and battles, etc., and storms, children are the number one victim, and then come males. And of those children, it's usually boys, then girls, and adult males, who are often harmed in wars and in storms. Because why? Because whatever, a lot of females are trying to save themselves. Not to say that females are selfish. No, they'll save their own children, obviously, if they can. But if it comes down to them or her, she's probably going to want to do both, but she'll try to save herself. And men are designed to be the provider and guardian for all, but he has no one guarding him. Hence the reason in certain cultures they set up guilds or brotherhoods, if you will, that were for men to protect each other and work with each other in society. But then, of course, came the program of feminism that said, you're doing things behind our back so that you can keep us subjugated. Females are never subjugated in this realm. Of course, there's case-by-case basis in various places, obviously, but the number one victim of slavery, etc., have always been males. The number one groups of people brought to the Americas is using these more contemporary times regarding so-called slavery. The number one groups first, before they did the changeover and started using so-called Negro Americans, they were Caucasoids brought in, and they were primarily males. If they were females and they looked good or they were a certain age, if you sold them to so-called Moroccans or Moors or Arabs, they would end up in harems, and they wouldn't be mistreated. They might be servants within a house, but they wouldn't be treated like a male would be treated. Males were often castrated so that they couldn't impregnate anybody, and then they would work, as I said, until they were gone. That would defeat this feminist program talking about how females are mistreated and females get less. That's bogus, because it's within a man's nature to protect the female. Obviously, we know that otherwise these things exist, but what are you looking at when you look at the heart of it all? But a male is acting out like that. That's a heightened toxic emotion or psychotic emotion, and where is it coming from? These are actual stats, if you want to look at stats. Most males that go into that realm of being and behavior, rather, are males who have come through a mother, in the sense of being raised solely by a mother, or by a toxic male who was also raised by a mother. Most of the males in prison come through that whole solitary motherhood situation where their father was not there, or that father was chased off, or that father came through a similar situation. People want to stop at one realm and not go beyond that. You know, it's easy to say, well, his father was abusive. Okay, the father was abusive. Father was this, the father was that. But let's look at beyond his father. Where did his father come from where he could spread this? And why did this female, called his mother, pick that man to lay with? No one forces these women into these situations. This is what they want you to believe and look at it like that. Media is made of such stories. They want you to think this. The female knows exactly what she's doing. She knows who she's mating with. She has a choice.
So, like in the Matrix, the woman is the mother of all the programs.
You can say that in a sense, yeah. You know, some say that all spirits are female in the sense that they have to come through the material world and realm. But I'm not too keen on that. I would say that the spirit has no gender; it's neutral. It can be utilized by anyone, and so therefore it's more neutral formatted.
So that's why they say angels are androgynous.
But as an angel, a spirit, an angel can take on a spirit form, but if it's a program that humans can't touch. So-called sentients can't touch. You cannot program a human no more than you can program the so-called counterpart or opposite of an angel. I'm just using the terminology here. I'm not saying one exists or not, but the opposite of an angel would be a so-called demon, allegedly, or so-called fallen one, or Nephilim. And either one, you're not programming. You, according to story, according to mythology, and even the Bible, they can be invoked. But when you invoke them, who's in charge? You would have to know everything about that thing and its controlling systems, and you would have to have mastery over your own realm. And not to say that there are beings that didn't and do exist that know these things, because if you bring something like that in or you invoke it as a spirit form, you have to maintain control over it, because remember, it's not coming through the natural means. You think of we'll look at the story of so-called Jesus. He didn't come through, he had to come through natural means, but in order to come through natural means, whoever did the impregnating had to either do what? Because we're taught that we're taught that a message, and that could be euphemism, and it usually is, a message was brought to her and she said yes. Referring to Mar or Maria or Mary, she said yes to the message in order to receive what? Wasn't sperm. According to Immaculate Conception, sperm does not violate the egg. They call it violation. I don't call it violation, but that's the term that they use. So in the act of coitus, in this instance, there was no coitus, there was just impregnation and conception, or conception and then impregnation.
So via some sort of dream, scenario, angel is coming through and creating some sort of impregnation through some other means.
That, or again, if you want to use logic, that means that all sentients all sentients not only have, but all sentients are merely code. And therefore, if they are code, you just need to know the code that's necessary to cause an egg to become fertile or fertilized. So you just implement that code through words. You know, how do humans, the console of the so-called human or the sentient, if they are a complete console, just everything is a console, how does it get into you? We take in things through mouth, through orifices, through ears, through eyes. So in other words, if this so-called angel had to embed the code, we're taught that in this Bible that it came through words. It doesn't really go into, was this a dream? or was this her reality?
I mean, like if you're looking at coding itself, I guess in a rudimentary way, like they say, like a bit is like a binary code. Like you can have a male, male and female polarities in a bit, and if you have 8 bits, it makes a byte, and a byte is a word. They call it a word in technical terms. So this is the what you mean on a spiritual or metaphysical level. Like there is some sort of input of a byte or a code into the woman.
Correct. And then you have a Satan, you have a Lucifer, or Satan, you have a parity bit. That's to make sure that you have, it's like the check and balances. Because, if you're looking at it in that light of a so-called programmer, then the programmer knows, and the programmer allows the parity bit. So the programmer allows the satanic, the Satan, the shaitan. Obviously so. Otherwise, would do another, not necessarily a leap, but a step in logic. Otherwise, that would mean all things being equal, shaitan is equal to the creator. Because if one's an adversary, typically an adversary is your equal, or one that can do enough damage, or one that is holding something over your head by holding a collateral or holding a hostage. In either case, if you're over that which you made, you don't have to deal with hostages or terrorists. As they say, we don't negotiate with terrorists. There would be no negotiating. You just destroy it and get your people back. So that tells you right there the same thing, the existence of so-called pathogens. They're there. They shouldn't be there, but we're not in a world of shouldn't. We're in a world of what is. And you protect yourself from what is, even if you don't see it.
So, when we're talking about like I guess in a more reduced analogy of like the Matrix, where the woman, the melanated woman is the mother of all the programs. Is it like, and that's why, again, like we were saying, like Lucy's the first humanoid that, sparks the theory of evolution, that yada, yada, yada. But, is, because that's the whole thing. Like, I remember we were talking years ago and you were talking about how like white people or so-called white people are actually the Africans, because Africa was a land of cryptids and humanoids and hybrids. And that was a place for that. And that's
correct.
And that's what this infatuation with this out of Africa theory is, because they're not really lying about their own. They're not lying. They're just telling the truth, I guess, for themselves.
When Edgar Rice Burroughs, I think, wrote Tarzan, he could have picked South America, but he picked Africa to write. Put that character Tarzan. So yeah, life did come from out of Africa, but not the life you're thinking about, or the life that you're taught in all of these academic spaces. They're referring to a particular group, and that particular group was more than likely an experiment. And who was running these experiments? More than likely some, could have been Shemitic, but I doubt it. I think it was more of if the allegories are actual, there would have been a Canaanite group of beings, intelligent beings that were experimenting on the cave that was not done yet. And from there, they started to just come in and maybe populate the area, colonize the area. If you look at Africa the way it is designed and set up, not really for people. You would have to be intelligent people to go in, and the ancestors of a lot of people who are there, they're highly intelligent. And they set up cities, etc., in Africa, but they weren't supposed to, I don't think. And just looking at it from my studies, that place was designed for animals. In fact, Edom went into Africa for its circuses. So-called Rome went into Africa to get animals for its circuses, for entertainment. You literally can be equivalent of a millionaire back then if you had an animal trade. People were buying exotic pets. It was a sign of wealth, no differently than today, having a pit bull or whatever. You had a particular type of animal, could have been a panther, a tiger, whatever, an elephant, even if you had the land. And, they do this. If you went to Saudi Arabia or Abu Dhabi, you see these guys that are, Turkic origins, and they have tigers in their backyard. This is nothing new. So, yes, Africa was set up and designed for animals specifically. It's probably one of the first places that animals were released after the alleged deluge or supposed deluge. I should say alleged, but supposed deluge. And there are many accounts of deluges around the world in various cultures. So that points to it more than likely having happened at least once. But Africa was probably the place where animals were released. And for them, so it was for animals. But Canaan invaded, and like a lot of people you see today, they go into the marshlands, they go into the wetlands, and they put up a mall. Not supposed to be there.
Yeah, I think you always hear about Yaqub, at least like from the Nation of Islam perspective, and which would be I don't know, that would be Jacob, and so
You see, they're twisting it. That could be their very group coming forth, or their ancestry coming forth through their tongues, through their so-called logic, and deliberately twisting things so that the blame is taken off of their ancestor and put on someone else.
Okay, so are like leprechauns and these cryptids, are they from Africa?
When you think of leprechaun, what do you think of? Take the word apart.
Leper.
Leper. Okay, yeah. Where do lepers usually live, and where do leprechauns usually live?
Ireland, somewhere like fungusy, somewhere that's where you can live in if it's cold.
They stayed away from people. Right, they were like troglodyte in the sense they stayed away from people. They stayed away because they were shunned. So you found them and you could live in under trees because they had subterranean hovels in many trees in certain forests, or you lived in certain caves or caverns, but you lived away from people. And as a result, some lived quietly and that's all they wanted. Others, you had to watch yourself if you went into the wood or into the bramble or into the brush, because you could be attacked, and depending on the time and frame of your existence, you could be eaten. There are many instances in the so-called medieval era or epoch where children were the number one food supply for those who dwelled in the forest. Not their own, but they would literally go onto the fringes of small villages or outcrop villages and steal people's children for the purposes of eating. This is where we get a lot of the fairy tales from, the Grimm fairy tale, and a lot of the so-called practices, so-called celebratory practices that they have till this day. The Krampus or Krampus, the Zwarte Piet. They would have stories of Jack and Jill. These are stories of children being taken away in sacks and rushed off to some cave, Pied Piper. All of these tales, and then of course they get whitewashed, unintended,
Hansel and Gretel.
And correct. And many of them had to do with eating of children.
So did they have their place? They had their place within the overall equilibrium. Like I guess you have like animals in some spot, like kind of like you were saying before, like how there's like elephant graveyard. There's like places that's just for spiritual or metaphysical beings, and then there's like places for animal spirits, and I guess animal cryptids, human cryptids, and then there's places for man, and then I guess places for the
mankind, human, man, everybody has their place. Fish has its place. You see the fish in the water, they don't belong in your kitchen. Obviously, they wouldn't survive in your kitchen unless you're going to eat them. So everything has its place. When you violate that, you're violating that which is an order. And this is the way of the world right now, and has been, it's not new, violating of order
So why like what is this infatuation with the black box? Is that like just like a euphemism for like this program creator, this melanated program creator? Is that like because what is the Saturn thing? Saturn, Satan, the black box on
monolith.
on the so-called Jews, the that place in Mecca where they got the black cube.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the monolith. The cube has been associated with Saturn, as you brought up, with Kronos, with time also. If you notice there was Becca and Mecca, two different places, but the actual place should be Becca, but now it's Mecca. But in any case, you notice that they spin around, and they're usually in white garb, and they spin a certain way around the cube. If you were to go into the cube and into the inner chamber of the cube, you would find the Kaaba, and the Kaaba looks like a vagina. And so you have the Kaaba, and then you have the lingam in the Vatican, and in parts of India you have that represented, and then you have the amalgamation of it in many different areas. So these are connected groups. They all worship the same so-called gods, or in some cases goddesses. Same thing. They're interchangeable. And I mentioned this before, even some of the names that are making a resurgence, coming out of the closet, if you will, being mentioned by their clergy, the ones who are learned clergy. The masses, they just do what they're told in the sense of what you read in your epistle or your whatever book, but you don't go outside of that. That's why most places, most churches, temples, etc., they're not set up for Q&A. They're just set up for passively receiving and then going home. You can't stand up, raise your hand, and ask a question. You can, but people are so trained, everyone around you will probably tell you to shut up or chase you out.
Yeah, and so like you have this, I guess, this worldwide, like you said though. I mean, some people are mutants, but then like some people are just manufactured people. Like I don't know if it's, I'm sure we see them all the time. There's plenty of people like that, I guess, but like, is there any place for something like that? Like you got the place for man or humanity. But mankind, and then you're getting into actual clones or manufactured, like basically GMO people, I guess. So like it's a graft.
Remember my saying from 2009, hybrid food for hybrid people? Now it's becoming reality, so-called reality. It was already, but you now see it has meaning, true meaning, because you're seeing it in the real. If you're not hybrid, then you wouldn't want that stuff. In other words, if you can stomach it and you can, pardon this euphemistic term, if your health can profit from it, then that was made for you. You have found your people, you have found your food, you have arrived. But if it's making you ill, if it is terminating your sex cells, your sperm and egg, if it's harming them, if it's causing you issues in many different realms, if it's creating havoc in your cognitive functions, that's not for you. You are hybrid intolerant. So if you answered yes to, yeah, you can get down with some McDonald's and anything else that's not real, no problem. Well, maybe you found who you really are. That's why I said, and I will continue to say, be careful who you mate with. This goes across the board. It has nothing to do with your race. It's nothing so-called race. It has nothing to do with your color. But question who you are. If you follow a group like a pack of wolves, you're more than likely hybrid. Or you've been hybridizing in the brain, in the thought process. And again, as I mentioned, if this stuff, if glyphosate is like lemonade to you, you're hybrid. That should be a meaning, you know your hybrid when.
Yeah. Because so for some reason you got the anaerobic or the fungal setup to even be doing this. But
And most fungus require oxygen, by the way. But that's why I mentioned a hybrid.
So why would Solomon? Because I read in the Apocrypha that Solomon is summoning demons to build the temple, and then
Because only they would have that kind of information. And when they say building, it's no different than when someone says Verrazano built that bridge in New York. No, he didn't lift a finger. Other people, you don't even know their name, they built it. So when Solomon didn't lift a finger, he drafted things, and he got maybe some people who had some walk-ins, because they were doing the whole abracadabra, abramelin. They're the ones who originated it. And so they could have a walk-in come into a scribe or an architect, and then for the next few weeks, a few months, a few days, they could draft up the designs, and then voila. But the designs are based on, this is what most people don't know, in order to have a powerhouse, it has to be built in a certain angle, on a certain series of lines or grids, so-called ley lines. And then, of course, other factors, have to exist as well. The churches or cathedrals do this. If you notice in most cathedrals and churches, they have to have a relic in them, and they do. That would be bones, allegedly of some saint, or who knows where they got the bones from. But they claim it's of some saint. It could be any kind of bone of the person's body part. And each has a relic. So the more relics it has, the more affinity that place has for attracting spirits that are dialed into. Hence the reason for saints. Saints are like telephone operators of old. You saw the old operators of the past, when landlines, they plug you into your call. Well, the saint would be an intercessor. They have access to help you connect.
So it would be
without
like
that saint, you can't. So that people would call on their saints in order to get that connection. So, and you needed certain alchemical trinkets and gesticulations or motions, etc., and potions in order to contact them. Kind of like a tangible telephone number made up of different things. And depending on the purpose, sometimes blood is used, or the transmutation or transfiguration of blood, like wine, which represents blood, and then you use that. And some use actual blood of an animal, and then the smoke and the blood together, and with certain words, which I won't repeat here, will bring forth the direct connect, or will bring forth an intercessor, like a receptionist. How can I help you?
So you get like a symbiote. So like Solomon was like, we're going to usher in a symbiote. We're going to get Asmodeus to come here and be in this scribe real quick to get.
Yeah, he had 12 of them. He had 12. He had a total of 12. Again, people might say, "Oh wow, this is all astrological." No, there's a reason for 12, and it's not just astrological. So he had 12, and of these 12, they worked together on this particular, because through them came this wisdom that sentients usually didn't have, because just like people today, they didn't have access to it either. They had to bring in those who knew it, and often they were not from here.
Why do these demons know it? And like, what, like, as far as like Solomon
had a hand in putting it together. This is put together by groups, not just one. And when I say groups, they had to manifest in form. So many things are not what you think.
So a demon's a program.
It's a program. It's an elemental program.
So you're just like, I need this app to help me build this temple. And
the elements that go with it in order to bring it forth. That's why, when people associate certain plants, those plants, if you look at them in the elemental structure, you find out, that's why this plant is associated with this or this. just look at how people have associated, and again, not focusing on one religion. Certain flowers are associated with certain so-called protagonists in religious realms. For example, Mary, and certain flowers are associated with Mary, and certain things are used to bring about Mary, like rose water, sometimes lilies, and people often who claim they go through hallucinations claim they smell rose water when there's a manifestation of the so-called virgin. No different than when people say they smell sulfur or brimstone or some foul stench in a so-called haunting. I'm not putting anything down or saying otherwise, but yeah, if someone's experience is their experience, and not to say that these things do not happen and did not happen, but more than likely they did happen and do.
So who created these demons, and what was Solomon's ring? Was it an actual ring? Because it was saying that Asmodeus took his ring and then was able to take his identity for a period. And I just, is it actually a physical ring, or is it something else?
You have the Lord of the Rings, and that was a ring. And with that ring, you can do what? So rings are often a manifestation of a connection or a nexus. When you think of a ring, you think of a portal, and you have to go through that portal in order to make a connection or a nexus. In the marriage ritual, the ring, this is an old ritual that didn't just start here or in Europe or other places that practice it, but there is a connection between them all, if you notice. But that ring represents a portal, and when there's a nexus between the two entities, the soul and spirit or soul and soul, now they have a connection, and so they both wear rings. Well, a ring is a portal, and if he had this ring imbued with the power of that intelligence of those beings brought forward, then that ring could be used in a poetic verse sense of an incantation. So the ring, along with the incantation and the invoking, had the so-called power.
I guess I'm just wondering, like, how the demon, like, who would create the demon, and how would the demon ever get the will to do something like that, to somehow displace Solomon and assume his identity, if this was ever to take place? I mean, like, I don't know. I just was reading it, and I'm just like, why would anyone create these demons? I guess, like, it's just like creating a wood chipper.
Why would, when you have a doubt or your brain is about to burst, bring it back to self and things that you may or may not know from experience or maybe experimentation or from things that are close to tangible in your realm. And I always say, look to your so-called vessel or so-called body, your vessel or so-called body. And that will explain other factors. This is not making a correlation, because that can be dangerous, but this is showing you that a demon exists just like a parasite exists. And then if you want to ask that question, why and who, well, first ask why. Why would a so-called demon be created? Okay, now just replace demon with parasite. Why would a parasite be created?
To process something that you aren't supposed to be processing or don't want to process. Like a calculator processes math that you no longer know. That's what I'm assuming. Like, you, for whatever reason, have some atrophy, or you're taking on something that you shouldn't be doing or not ready to do. And so now you have this parasite that's doing the processing for you. That's the only way I would think it would manifest. It's like you eat something, bad food combination, or something not designed for you, and now a parasite has to manifest to help you break this down because you don't naturally have the tools.
That and a lot of other factors, such as the ones we've gone over in this particular session of encroachment, invasion, that exposes you to things that may not be in your niche. You know, they claim in these history tales, pardon my day, academia, which is made up of people across the span of so-called time, have put together stories and accounts that we are taught to accept, claiming that the so-called Indian of North America, and not only, but primarily the Indian. You notice they don't say it too much about other groups. They might say it about some islanders, but primarily of the Indians. They say when the so-called European arrived, they spread disease just by their very presence, and sometimes deliberately, poisoning a well with their urine and saliva and dirty clothes, or whatever, sending someone into a camp who had some kind of disease, smallpox, whatever, deliberately, in order to spread it, because these individuals allegedly didn't have access to those unseen externals, and therefore they succumbed to them because they never had them or heard them before. Are they to be blamed for that? Are they to be blamed for their so-called ignorance? Somehow, some way, the meeting occurred, if we were to go with those accounts, with those tales. But if the actual facts are told, the so-called Negro Aboriginal, which they enslaved later, after wars, many different wars, and were already also being enslaved by the so-called Mongol, didn't get ill from the so-called European. Now, why didn't they get ill? Is this the case of the super Negro, like I talked about before? They can withstand months on a ship, on a seagoing vessel, in the hull, withstanding all different body fluids and changes of temperature and hypothermia. And of course, beatings and lashings, et cetera, only to get off the boat, get sold, and go right to work. Come on, you buy that? Well, they didn't succumb to the illnesses of the so-called white person. So that tells you if someone's lying, yes, Europe was disgusting and foul in some places like England, in big cities, but not all over Europe. The same time the so-called foulness and stench was happening in London, if you go to Venice, these are so-called white people. There was no foulness and stench, so who's lying? Are the English the only nasty people on the planet? Don't answer that. But in any case, you're told a lie and you're taught to accept it, and that lie will stop you from using logic. Logic will tell you that you encourage certain types of actions within and without. So a so-called demon is brought about by the negligence of those who came before you or by your own actions, just like a so-called parasite is. So if people had not been warring amongst each other, foreigners, so-called foreigners, probably wouldn't have stood a chance in violating. And then, of course, just because I mentioned one group was here before another doesn't mean that all things were beautiful and flowers and daisies. No, they were doing things that they were not supposed to. These are supposedly the Shemites, the original Shemites. What were they doing? Look at the temple walls that are still remaining. They were doing things that they weren't supposed to. They were worshiping whatever, and those so-called gods were demanding things of them, and they were delivering. So if you were the originator, creator, would you respect that? Would you allow it? Obviously you would allow it, but you would respect it. You would give people enough time to change, or like a gardener, you would slash and burn, so that certain things are wiped out over a generation. We've gone into the generational periods that things wipe themselves naturally clean. The 70 and the 700. Certain things are just gone. 700 years prior, most have no clue other than what you're told, and usually what you're told is completely false. So there's a cleansing just by being. Do you know who your relatives were 700 years ago? Most don't. In fact, I would say a large percentage do not. Is that information available? Yeah, you'd have to dig and find it, and it's not online. It's definitely sequestered.
And how many people are just repopulated clones that are not even that many? The original clone that was like injected into the system is not even that many hundreds of years old.
Well, that's the other thing about empire structures. Empires are built to maintain chaos in mating. When there is no chaos in mating, there's less people. Not that there's a lot of people, that's also a lot too. Not a lot of people in this realm. The place is almost half empty.
I'd assume there'd be a lot more people if these mountains were metropolises.
Correct. You had more people in the past than you did today. But the thing was, you were practicing, for the most part, not all, this is nothing new. Just because I'm talking about it in the so-called now doesn't mean that it's contemporary and it's something of today only. No, this is going on then. People were doing the same thing then as far as mating is concerned, mating randomly, etc. Well, when you do that, this is going to bring about the so-called demon and the so-called parasite and the so-called chaos. Mating is meticulous. You want to talk about ultimate technology, it's the ultimate organic technology, if you will. You want to use those terms. So therefore, you must use not only due care, but you must want to be a master craftsman. You want only the best.
And if you find that you are a clone or a demon, what do you do? Like, what, as far as like in that circumstance? Because it's like you just omit, I guess. You just not even. Or why would you even partake if you're gonna make more slaves?
Ask that again.
Like if you're a clone or a demon and you come across and you, it's like a self-realized parasite, and you realize what you are and what your clan or people or whatever you want to call it, what they are. Then why would you even, like, what do you do? Like, how do you even maintain any kind of morale? Because it's like you're not even, you just would subtract yourself, I'd assume. Like, why would you even engage with anything? Because it's like, you know, these are problems that like were created by people like me. I'm a part of the problem. Why not just remove myself altogether and then let the people that, like you said, like if the original people were not warring with each other or praying to vain gods or doing vain things or whatever, then they would be in a different circumstance. But that's something that they have to undo themselves. It's not even like, is it even possible for the parasite to even assist in somebody else's like problem that they created for themselves? Like they just have to stop abusing or stop supporting the abuse and just remove themselves, I guess. Because like, how would they even, like, what is their role or their position?
Let's keep that question concise so that we don't lose people. I'd like to hear from people listening too. But every sentient and every aspect of living plays a part, is a catalyst in some way. So as science says, bioscience has claimed that parasites, viruses, are partially responsible for diversity in the sentient structure of things. Maybe there's truth to that. Because when you think about what occurs as a result of epidemics, it does determine or influence patterns, whether it's the logistical patterns or mating patterns, etc. Or just weeding out, the strong survive, the weak succumb to these unseen entities, microbes, etc. So in a sense, you could say, okay, a parasite can say that they are making a difference. If it wasn't for someone's actions, another person's actions may not happen. And as I always say, you've heard me say, we are portals. That's one way. Being a portal makes a difference or has an impact in this realm of the physical. We are all portals, so we impact one another, regardless of whatever. I'm not going to say someone is not a demon, but for the most part, I would have doubt that any being, any sentient is an actual demon in that regard. But parasite, that's different, because you can succumb to the will of parasites, especially if you're housing them and welcoming them and harboring them gladly. You can become parasitic. So yes, there are lots and lots and lots and lots of parasitic sentients, and they transcend all manifestations of people. In other words, they're in all different formats. Look at the political realm, for example, which I don't usually do, but look at people who are in so-called conservative spaces. And so-called liberal spaces too. They're kind of the same, semantics. But look at how they behave, and look at their mindset when faced with just a question alone, not a dilemma. No one asks them to physically do something. But look at what occurs when faced with just a question. Some will feign that they'll answer the question or that that's not them or it doesn't apply to them. But, for example, so-called racism. How many so-called white people are moved enough to actually get up and do something about racism to make it end? And I don't mean protest. That doesn't work for anybody. Black, white, whatever. And pardon me for using those terms. I don't like those Masonic terms, but regardless, it does nothing. So, I mean, as far as actually making changes in your household, putting your money where your mouth is, and I don't mean to some, so-called Negro cause, which is more than likely run by the same people who are, again, funding racism. So, no, I don't mean that. I mean actually making a true difference. Very few are going to actually do something. And you can take it to another degree. How about homelessness? How many people are actually ready and willing to take in a homeless person? You walk down the street, ignore them, pray for them. That's the loveliness of all religions, from Judaism to Christianity. Everybody wants to pray, but nobody wants to do. And that's in violation of another saying in the book, faith without works is, you know what it is. So all of these things come down to what are you going to do? And so I say, if you don't want to be faced with all this crap, make your true community. I'm not talking about your gated community of made up of people like you. That's a joke. You get parasites deliberately in places like that, child rapists or something, or who knows what. And you deserve it because you're putting on a facade. And I mean a true community. And that is what everyone is tasked with doing, especially those right now in this hegemony who look like the power brokers of the hegemony. It's your responsibility. No differently than when the hegemonies were a melanated realm, a controlling system. And I don't think that melanated controlling system has gone away, by the way. I think it's just it's undercover. You have more power and clout when you stay in the shadows, and you just put your front office people out there. Yeah. I think a lot of that's happening too. I think a lot of the so-called white people are just front office, and behind the scenes you got some melanated people pulling the strings. Because why would they give up what they had from the beginning of time, so-called time? Actually, there's no real beginning of so-called time. The beginning of all this empire madness. you wouldn't. You would just make things change hands. So it kind of fools those who buy what you see.
Yeah, I mean, that's for sure. I don't doubt that at all. It's just like the Tao Te Ching. In the Tao Te Ching, it says the best leader is one that people hardly know exists, and then the worst ones, it goes down like one. The next best is one that's loved, and then it's one that's feared, and then it's one that's despised. That's the worst one. So it's like if you're not known, people are hardly know, then you're the best at leading. And I guess ultimately the creator originator would be kind of like so sublime in that way. It reflects that, like something so sublime, it's leading in a very subtle, very sophisticated way.
Sophisticated, complicated, complex, definitely. You know, the words that come out of Paleo or Proto-Hebraic tradition point to a multiplex of beings, if you will, all equal, not a pantheon, nothing like that, and nothing in the realm of animistic, you know, or nature-based, nothing like that. But in the complex sense that most sentients have a difficulty to fathom, was that because they usually the brain of the sentient resorts to, you know, conflating this with that or turning this into something it can ingest. No different than cultivating something that they can ingest, turning something that they really don't want to look at or eat and turning it into something that they want to desire. Well, this is the mentality of most, not all. Obviously, those here today may not have that. And you might be speaking to those who don't have that kind of mindset, so-called mindset. But when it comes to Elohim or Eloha, there's one and then there's many. Or not necessarily many, there is a given number, but there's one and many, and that's represented in word, not necessarily name.
Yeah, I remember Bobby Hemmett used to say that, like, because in heaven, you just one. Everything is one. There's no separation between you and the gods or whatever. And it made sense to me. I don't know if that's the best way to put it, but it made sense to me that, like, if you're going into that echelon of existence or being or truth or reality, that you can't be in any kind of doubt or separation. It's going to be like complete intimacy, like real intimacy.
Okay.
That's what I would assume.
Well, where did this, again, I want to point to that before we conclude about the concept of so-called heaven. That was injected as well. It's for those folks who like binary, you got heaven and you got hell. You got devil and then you got God, so-called God. You got black and then you have white. You see the danger of these things? There's nothing wrong with binary, but this is a perversion of it. And so therefore, it blinds you to look in a more profound way and a logical way at all of these so-called concepts. You know, Mother Earth is a concept, but can you show me this mother other than these manifestations in statuettes, etc., or in just words? No, you can't. I can show you aspects that are both feminine and masculine from the same place. I can show you so-called history where one was referred to as masculine and one was referred to as feminine. The so-called earth was once referred to as masculine. So did it get a sex change? No, we have manifestations within everything that you can claim, represent, or have a resemblance to. what we think of as a gender, for example, but they're just representations, or they're just resemblances to or semblances of. But when it comes to creator originator, we know that of the recorded words that were left within ancient texts, all of them point to a combination of one and many, all at the same time and not. Again, a paradox.
It's kind of like you used to say negation is creation. You know, I guess there's like, you know, the oneness has to get reduced into like some sort of differentiation, and that produce like that through that negation things are produced, or reduction. That reduction is production in that sense, like somehow, and that's where like I came into, I guess, the tree of life or the Kabbalah and things like that. Like that's where I could see where it makes sense. Maybe that concept gets hijacked through those ideas, but it does make sense that there is like a oneness, and then this oneness somehow gets splintered, and each part of the reduction or negation is not like it's a separate thing. It's just another like faculty or part of the one, and I just always
look at your vessel. You got fingers, you got elbows, you got knees. So these are just names given to these parts. But you also have internal. You don't see them, but they're there. And they're all separate. And they're all together. They perform various functions, but they perform various functions for the whole, the entirety.
Yeah, definitely.
If your hand were to suddenly just detach from the rest of you and say, you know what, I'm going to do my own thing, and I am going to be a thorn in your side. So when you're out on the field, watch out, because I'm coming out there. So you're going to see this left hand throwing rocks. Would that be your devil? And why don't you just go get it and get it re-attacked? What if your left hand was going out there and tripping up people, literally making them fall or fumble? If they were doing things that were not, wholesome. Is that what a devil is supposed to do? Is that the left hand? You have the left hand and the right hand.
I mean, I guess it would be just something that is like a free radical, something that is like kind of disjointed, that's not in harmony, that needs some type of solution to become part of the one.
You can make free radicals just by breathing.
Because my understanding of a free radical is kind of like, it's like, all right, so like if you have loose. If you're drinking OH, you're not drinking H2O, you're not drinking H3O. You're drinking denatured water, and now you have more. There's not enough hydrogen atoms in your system, so you would need something to bind to these oxygen atoms to create a balance, and so you'd have something like H3O or what have you to merge or like attract those oxygens or those free radicals, those loose oxygen atoms, so that they don't try to, clash or bind with things that they're not designed to bind to. And
so you're talking about instability, allegedly, of so-called oxygen molecules. Is that what you're referring to?
Well, yeah. I guess like as far as like the oxygen molecules, if the oxygen atoms, if they're not in a molecule that's combined with hydrogen atoms, that's what I would hear would be a free radical, something that doesn't have a home in a sense. It's single. It's like it's not in a molecule. It's an atom that's just free roaming and just clashing with other things. Doesn't have any home, like molecularly, I guess you could say.
Okay. Okay, well, this may sum up everything that you have asked questions about. It's a process, and the process is done for primarily so-called energy, and the use of oxygen is a necessary component, especially for your, primarily for your so-called cells. And in this process, the so-called oxygen molecules, they can become unstable just by nature of activities, like breathing. And so you get this, there's a term for it, there's an actual term for it, it's so-called science. And they're called, I just know they stand for ROS. It stands for something, ROS, reactive species, I think it's reactive oxygen species. So they're actually another species all in themselves. They are an actual so-called species in themselves out of a process that's actually organic or natural. But here's the thing. Your vessel is designed to neutralize free radicals and then prevent them from causing, major problems or major damage. What happens is something comes in and assists in the form of, breaking down processes, causing deficiencies, and this increases the amount of free radical. And what is that thing that comes to assist? Would that not be humans? So the face of the so-called devil is a human one, because humans are the ones that actually facilitate or assist deviltry, so-called deviltry. In this case, I'm using it as a so-called euphemism, not necessarily a metaphor, for those reactive species, those reactive oxygen species, and free radicals.
And
therefore, returning to or recognizing that there's a natural order and returning to that would be the equivalent of homeostasis. And then this would, of course, reduce or even convert free radicals into what they're supposed to be, and then you would be able to utilize completely any oxygen molecules as energy conduits, as they're designed to be.
And you're not.
This is the realm we're in. It's a large representation of what goes on within us. But if you're distracted from knowing about how you operate, how you function, and all the things that you are required to utilize while here, and how to utilize them, and when to utilize them, you are merely manifesting more chaos. And more chaos produces more of the parasites in all forms. So just mating alone, which is considered a natural act, it is, but it's still unnatural if you're going to bring forth more parasites.
Yeah, I think you're speaking very directly. It's not cryptic at all. It's very. I think people just might not be very versed in some of the terms, like the way you're using them, as far as what you mean by humans and whatnot. If they're but some maybe, and some that are watching, I'm sure they are. But that's the thing. That's I feel like my biggest issue or my biggest hang up in this situation is like, man, where is my position in all of this if I'm just a program? Because like based on everything that led me to meeting you, like I feel like some part of me was aware enough to study these things and stomach these things to where I could listen to certain things that I know other people that might be pale, they never stomach it, they'd never listen, they never hear people out. So there's some part of me that was like, well, you need to sit through this. But then it's like another part of me that's like kind of like, I don't know, it's like almost like picking at a wound. It's like I'm searching for something that proves that I'm worthless in a lot of ways. And so then like I came into a certain understanding I guess in like a rudimentary or basic level, like certain things allowed me to where when I interface with you, when I connected with you, it allowed me to like get even better kind of at like communicating like self-hate to myself, because like I was like I had certain understanding, I guess, like as far as about like inbreeding creating albinism or Lukism and the Canaanites, all of these stories within the Bible about lepers and what it means to be pale and everything. And so, and then I have my own personal experiences of just, people in my family, people close to me that weren't pale, and characteristics and traits that they had that I felt like I was lacking in myself. And so I feel like I searched and found like why I'm the devil, why I'm the bad guy, or why there's something wrong with me. And I felt like you were like the perfect person that you could bring, knowledge into my life. But then I feel like I was more so like I need to figure out how to not like myself better. How can I communicate? How can I communicate to myself that I need to not be here? And I feel like that's like the toughest thing for me to reconcile within myself, because I feel like everything I've picked up from you ultimately is like, and I don't want it to seem like I got a problem with it. I think that I'd rather know than not know. I'm glad I never got anybody pregnant up until this point. I'm glad like a lot of what I learned from you steered me away from certain things that would have been detrimental. But like, I feel like at the same time, it's hard for me to find any like real actual value or worth in myself when it comes into this conversation, because I look at it like, man, like if I'm just a pawn and I was just created to be some sort of program or like, residual creation that's here to like, I guess, cope with the situation that we're in and like process things like as, kind of like a parasite. I just feel like it's just difficult for me to like get this understanding what I've learned from you, accept it, and then at the same time find self-worth or value and like be able to like do anything. Because for me, like I kind of, in a lot of ways, I feel like I've given up on certain things in my life, because it's like, man, I really just want to somehow have some type of connection with the Creator to where I'm like, please just whatever you got to do, whatever I got to do to not, I guess, continue to be existing in a like just cease my existence and how is there a path for me to do that in a way that doesn't disrupt or harm the Aboriginal and the likes of the Aboriginal? Like, what can I do to just be removed from the equation in the least damaging way, or if there is a totally not damaging way? Because I looked at it like, is there any way for me to have a family or have a community or have people around if I'm a parasite and I just attract parasites? Because that's what genetically I'm basically like born a slave. Like, and so I looked at it like, damn, how can I accept all these things and at the same time do anything in the world or in the mundane world or the tangible world? Like, to me, it's like, man, all I really want to do is get some sort of like card or exempt, like something that will annihilate me without destroying other people or Aboriginals and disrupting their life. I've given up on the fact that I can even have a connection with a woman or a family, because like I'm like I don't know how that I could ever communicate that what I am is something that is of value or of worth in the world, because I just from what I've learned from you, like it's not that you taught me it and that I was already looking for that, like looking for confirmation on why I should be eliminated. And so like it's difficult for me, and that's why I'm like, man, Farrell, I feel like I'm in a tough spot, because I feel like the people that could even listen to me or follow what I'm saying, how much do they not like themselves? Because a lot of times Aboriginals, melanated peoples, they're not gonna fully listen to me a lot of the time, and they might, whatever they want, whatever I guess floats their boat, or I guess that whatever is like satisfying their vanity, a lot of the times they'll take that in. but they're not, I feel like generally speaking, they're not going to listen to me. So a lot of the times I'm just attracting parasites and people like, compromised individuals. So like, I'm just like, man, it's gotta be someone else, somebody more melanated, somebody that is more not a program, that is a soul that could work with you to deliver this message. And I could somehow just study y'all. That's kind of where I'm at. I'm like, how can I be in position to help people if I'm this creature? And if other people are in a worse genetic predisposition than me, how can I even tell them like, yeah, man, you should, how can I even motivate them to want to be alive? It's difficult. I feel like it's a conflict of interest inside myself a lot of the times. And I don't really know how to like, I don't want to disrespect you because I feel like I've learned a lot from you. And I feel like a lot of people can learn. There's a lot that people can learn from you. So I never want to detract from that. And I don't know how your relationship would be with other people. I think it could be very different than what it is with me, So I don't want to tell people like, look, just because I failed in my life or I was set up to be a clone or whatever, like he might communicate totally different with you than he does with me. So you should call him. You should communicate with him. I don't know what your relationship is going to be, but for some reason, me and you have maintained a connection throughout this whole thing. And I just be wondering why. It makes me second guess myself. And then at the same time, I remember like we've talked before where you said things like, because I was saying things like along the lines like my true self. And you were like, do you even have a self? And I feel like a lot of the times it was like, man, like I'm just a program, you know what I mean? So like, I don't have a self. I'm just this clone that doesn't come from a bloodline, like a natural one. And I feel like, damn, I can't tell. I'm only able to swim in so deep in the pool, and I can't tell how I'm being used. And it makes me very uncomfortable. It makes me really like nervous in that way. Cause I don't know. It's like you're a person that can go very deep into reality and into dreams and subconscious and consciousness. Like you can go very deep into that. And I got to take your word for it. Cause I'm not even experiencing that stuff. Like I'm not getting any recall if I am. So like that's my part where I'm like, damn, Pharaoh, man, it's gotta be somebody that is a better example of what people are supposed to be that can work with you. And I really would like to find that person so I could learn from y'all. Cause I don't know how I can be absurd. I feel like I'm too, self-destructive in that way. Like if I can just focus and work and listen and study, then I feel like I can not be self-destructive. But when it comes to like, I guess like, having to do something other than that, if I have to go into, I guess this attempt into being what man is, I feel like, am I just faking the funk? Am I just lying? Am I just always going to be a program? I'm just going to be a closed loop portal and I'll never be able to get out of this situation. So I'm always going to be at the behest of souls or soul bearers or people like yourself. So it's like, I don't know what is I feel like it's difficult for me. Like, and I don't really know. I would love to deliver what you're saying because I know you have an eye that a lot of people don't have and maybe never will have. So I'm like, man, this is very precious material that people need in the world. But at the same time, I'm like, why would a fabricant be even useful in this situation? And I feel like I don't want to mishandle it. And a lot of times, like it puts me in a position where I'm like, I shouldn't be in this position. It's like the wrong person carrying the Ark of the Covenant or something. Like that's how it feels. And I know I just said a lot, but I really, I don't know. That's the only thing. Anybody listening that might be a better vessel for this transmission, I feel like you should reach out to Pharaoh because I don't know how. I don't want to discourage people. I feel like a lot of the times, if we get into me as a person, it's always gonna conflict and detract when you're trying to, or what you are not trying, what you're expressing is something that I feel like, is this even for me? It's like I'm carrying the Ark of the Covenant and I'm not supposed to be. I'm carrying the ring and I'm not supposed to be carrying the Lord of the Ring. You know?
If you can put all that into a question, that would be wonderful. But considering all things said, a glean from your statements made, or from, I'll just call it a soliloquy. From what there were inquiries and some sentences mixed in together. So, in short, the one thing that all sentients have, regardless of if they are, regardless of the percentage of parasite within or other, they still have something that is referred to as a will. They have intent. And with that will, you can truly display and exude humbleness, and then make those actionable ways of being. You don't get that. You don't see that. And when I say you, I'm using the English language, universal you.
Like second person.
Right, second person, which applies to all. You don't see that in these land masses that have succumbed to invasion and encroachment. You don't see that in the other places too. Well, most places have. What am I saying? Most places have been encroached and invaded. And what you get is an arrogance. And then, of course, you get denial that goes with the arrogance. And then you get this, okay, oh well, we're here. I say, in order to see how that feels, imagine in your home, your house, your family home, someone comes in and decides to just take over. They come in and they, you can stay if there's a basement or a shed, but we're taking over. And they do everything in their way to change everything about your home while they're in it. They cause fights with people down the street who then break your windows, even though they're not their windows, but they're breaking your windows. They use your resources. They make you, when you come back from work, they take your paycheck, if you will. And so they're living in your place, and then they start to say, this is ours. And we got this. We fought for this. This is ours. This is our nation. This is the mentality. This is the lack of humility that you see everywhere where there has been invasion and encroachment. That's parasitic. So what percentage of the individual is remaining? There's no such thing as privilege. Like, you heard the term white privilege. Doesn't exist, because privilege means you didn't do anything and it just happened. No, there's participation. There's a so-called white participation, meaning you participate even if it's in an innocuous way or a subtle way or in a so-called passive-aggressive way where you're saying, I'm not me. But the fact is, if it's not you, then you would pick up and go back into the realms where your so-called ancestry came from, because you don't want to be part of that whole mess. This is why people use we when they're referring to government and military action. Say, we did this, we did that. You didn't do anything, but still you say we. Well, therefore, that we means something. That means the fact that you're still on the ground and you're still within someone else's house. Where's the humility? Where's the actionable recourse? What are you going to do to make actual, tangible changes while you're in a place where you didn't do anything, but your ancestry did? So you got choices. You can leave and make it cleaner, better than what you left. Give back to those who are there and supposed to be there, and then move on. You got many choices. Or if you're going to remain where you are, literally live, breathe the humbleness that is supposed to be regardless of where you are. Everyone's supposed to have that within them and supposed to display it truly, not on the surface or a facade, so-called self, meaning feigning humbleness. That happens a lot. That's parasitic, literally. And when you do these things, it doesn't take away from who you are or what you are. What it does say is that You are now living for and only truth and nothing less and nothing more. That's it. You're not jealous of what you are not, and nor are you trying to be what you are not. Again, if it gets too profound or deep for you, then bring it into a level of something that you can readily comprehend. For example, if you're a woman, why would you be upset and jealous of what a man can do? You're not a man. You shouldn't want to be a man, and there's nothing that a man does that you should want to do. And the same on the other side. A man cannot get pregnant. Why would you want to? So you can experience it? That's silly. And for any female who says, you should feel what I feel, no, that's stupid. That's the epitome of stupidity. I don't want you to feel what I feel. If I was a woman, it's my purpose. It's not your purpose. And I'm not jealous of your purpose, and you shouldn't be jealous of my purpose. That's covetousness. We have a purpose, and therefore and I respect that. And that's what is missing. Humbleness, respect. You are not aboriginal to the place that your ancestors put you, and so you're not. Nor should you want to be, because that's not what you are. What you want to be is find out where you are aboriginal to. You're not going to find that under the guise of white or black. And mind you, there are a lot of so-called black non-aboriginals. They're from Africa, they're from the islands, they're from wherever, and they're mixing in, and you couldn't tell the difference. But they're in the same predicament, and many of them are just as arrogant. You don't do that. You don't try going to someone else's nations. That's why other nations don't play that when so-called Americans, whatever, go there. You gotta pay. You gotta do this, because what are they doing? They're nipping in the bud what they did over here, or what their ancestors did over here. So they're stopping it from happening in other places. But it's all the same. It's, as I said, the pot, calling the pot the pot. There's no humbleness. There's no respect. Start with that, and of course your will and your intent. That's all you have primarily, regardless of what base you are, what your core is. You have that, and that is what will manifest and make a difference. When you get blinded by all the other things, it's going to be difficult finding a mate, or not, pardon me, I don't like this word finding. It implies so much imbalance. I'm referring to when you encounter and select your mate, and vice versa. When you do that, it will be based on wisdom. It will be based on a correct option, not all of these other things that confuse you or drive you. You shouldn't be driven. And when it is appropriate, it is appropriate. You should be thankful. Many males are jealous that they're not females or whatever, for whatever reason. And again, that's sick. That's stupid. You should be thankful that you are male. You don't have to rush. A female has a clock, as I mentioned before. She has, she's going to mate and breed and bring forth offspring. She's got a certain amount of time to do so. So while she is distracted by all these programs, these spirits, she's missing out on what she's supposed to do, and she's missing out on the man that is her mate. And you're not supposed to be randomly having children with just anybody. So that, for anyone who thinks, oh, okay, I'm good, I had my babies, that's messed up too. You're just adding to the chaos. So when it comes to humbleness and respect, it's inward and it's outward. Are you humble and respectful to yourself? And are you humble and respectful outwardly? Are you observant? All of these things are part of, if you will, the fruit of the core. It's a constant. No differently than it's a constant to maintain your so-called health. It's a constant with all these other factors that I've been mentioning. And it's lifelong. It's like a workout. You work out, you get your body in the shape or so-called shape that you want, and then you just maintain. Yeah, well, maintenance is what? Maintenance is making sure all things are in order. And you do not, when you are forced to, compromise. You should, if you're forced by whatever purpose, you step back, you analyze the situation, and if you have to, you leave. Many people don't do that when it comes to mating, and so they just say, okay, I'm going to pick whoever's in this region, in this city, in this town. No, if it doesn't fit, get out. And the same thing for people who are going through familial situations. I'm all for familial nuclear households where people stay together and help one another because that's the basis of community. But if your household is against you, work yourself to the logical area of thought, meaning you build up to that, prepare, and then leave amicably. You're not fleeing. When you flee, that's a desperate act. Amicably part and maintain your connections. But you know that a place is parasitic and difficult to be there, then you logically, methodically exit. So that means what while you're there? Humbleness, quiet, observation, respect. That means you don't lose your respect and you respect others. You know what people are about. There's no need to try to proselytize them into some so-called holistic lifestyle. You know what they're about. People have eyes, they can observe. You're in a household, you're probably sharing the same refrigerator. They see what you eat and what you don't. And they can copy if they like. You never talk to people who are interested. Because interest is either entertainment or just using parasitic energy to eat from what you are. So these are the things that you apply to yourself or you imbue in yourself, regardless of where you came from. You came from others whose will and intent manifested you where you are today. So taking on what they have done is really not going to do anything for yourself. What you take on is what you are going to do and what you have done. Are you going to continue the parasitic activity? You have the will to, and you know better, or are you going to do otherwise and maintain it? Not just do it like those people of the 70s who are now the same people today who are toxic and chaotic and every other imbalance that you can think of. Yeah, I was there with those people. I was there with the people of the 50s and the 60s and all of them from all the various so-called subcultures, from the folk people to the so-called hippies. And yeah, they all sounded good on the surface. And like, oh, now the world's going to change because the people who look like the hegemony controllers, their children are lashing out. No, it's just a phase. Like a roach eating raid so that later on they know how to step on the Aboriginal even harder. Well, now you're at that so-called crossroads. No one is naive anymore. The Aboriginal, for the most part, recognizes what's happening. And no, there's no critical mass. It's not supposed to be. But those who know better, and they're not falling for it. So are you going to continue as the parasites do? Or are you going to get rid of the parasites as you would in your gut and any other place within your vessel? You have a will. The parasites don't want you to have that will. And the parasites include the ideologies that come from the people before you, in addition to the parasites that you can actually physically see and extract. They're all connected.
Yeah, I mean,
so there's no need for self-annihilation or anything like that. Again, that's more language that's parasitic. The parasitic language is complacent and lazy. Everyone's going to have a time now in this realm with all of these programs about these sentient programs finding, and I am saying that word again because you have been brought to a level of now finding a mate. That's unnatural. You're now in the world of the Cro-Magnon Neanderthal troglodyte, where you literally have to find a mate, and you don't want to be finding a mate. That's like looking through a dumpster and finding something and okay, taking it home. You're not supposed to be finding anything. That says you lack community. That says you lack true connection. You don't find a mate. And if that's the world you're in right now, yes, it's going to be difficult. But you cannot be lazy. You cannot be lazy when it comes to purging parasites. You have to do it meticulously, carefully, based on you. There's no Payless shoe store size fits all for everybody. Everyone has their own chemistry. Do things accordingly.
I mean, it like more so like if I am a blight, or I come from a blight of people that are a blight, then why would I even partake in anything like that would leave any of that going? Like, why would I even engage with anything that could lead to that? You know, and I feel
Does
like...
the genetically modified apple know that it's a GMO apple? And if so, what does it do amongst the orchard of apples that are organic? Does it spread that Frankenstein seed or whatever they're calling it? Does it spread that unnatural synthetic self? Or does it recognize what it is and realize, okay, not to spread that, and find ways to maintain itself without spreading poison? That's the main thing. If you know that this is where the household you come from, or the blood lineage you come from, you can nip that in the bud through your own thoughts. No pun intended when I said bud. You can nip that through your own thoughts and your actions and deeds and ways. You're not trying to pull the wool over anyone's eyes. You speak truth only, and you seek truth only. Otherwise, you go with what your program is. But if that's not you, and you know better, and you do, and this is for anyone, you do not go that route.
No, I definitely don't want to. I feel like I can't. I don't really have any confidence in spreading any of that. I feel like I don't see I feel like that would be a draw on resources, and on my own resources, on resources from the collective. Like, it would, I don't see how that would even be something that I should be doing. And that's why it's like, at the same time, it's like, why would I even, if at this point it's just like a kamikaze mission, because it's like, so I should just study and go inward and just be, why would anybody, why don't I just go into obsolescence?
Look at the mistakes that you've already made in your life. Look at the conversion, subversive actions of those that came before you. I mentioned before those so-called subculture groups like hippies. Look at the kids out of the first Woodstock. They were all about so-called nature and the terms that they used then, free love and all this other garbage. And on the surface, to a so-called naive aboriginal, they would think, oh, the world's changing because look at them. They look like Rockefeller, they look like Nixon, they look like the cop, but they're talking against that. Well, those same people are now supporting the cop. They sound like Nixon, they look like Rockefeller, they might have the same investments. So how did they change? So they didn't. And that's what you want to look at and say, okay, I'm not going to be that Woodstock kid. Because that's the same thing over and over again. That's the pattern. And the pattern is parasitic. Look at patterns. One of my mentoring initiatives teaches how to get out of patterns. These familiar patterns. They're legacies or curses, if you will. How to break these patterns and stay out of them and make sure they happen. Otherwise, you're just passing these down to your offspring. And that's a subversive, sneaky thing. What happens with that is your own offspring in your own household will be subversive. What goes on the external will go on the internal. You don't think these wealthy or upper middle class people, regardless of their so-called lineage, have it all wonderful? No, there's a lot of subversion going on in these households because that's what they're breeding. Parasites don't care about anybody. That's the thing you asked me when we were talking about, when you mentioned the questions about Solomon and bringing out demons. The thing about bringing these things out, they don't care about you. They're happy to be in the realm and they're going to use it at their advantage. So parasites within, that's all they're about, the proliferation of their kind, and they'll use you as a conduit. They don't care what you are. I don't care who you are, whether you're so-called European, Asian, so-called African, so-called Latino, whatever. A parasite will use you because it doesn't give about you. And it will use you as long as you allow it. And most people are living in the path of a parasite. The things that they eat. Come to many of these countries that both of you and I have visited. Walk through a supermarket. People are turning themselves into parasites. You know this stuff is wrong. We don't even have to talk about Bible or social issues, etc. Look at your supermarkets, your grocery stores. Look at the things that people are eating. They're living toxic. That's why streets smell. That's why water is foul. This is what's coming out of people. This stench is reaching to the heights.
Yeah, and I like, if I'm just some mycelium structure, like a spore based program, then I don't see why I would even be around other people, because the fear of the infection or them even taking on anything that that's like me or might be in my seed line or bloodline or even thought line. Like, I feel like,
well, ask yourself this, based on what I just described. Would you want to be around that type of individual? Someone that's just guzzling down all the stuff that I talked about. On the surface, they might look like they're healthy, but on the inside, they're harboring a lot of poisons, literally. Now, would you want to be around that kind of person? Or would you want to be around someone like yourself?
I mean, I definitely wouldn't want to play somebody like that close at all,
Right. So what's that say about the decisions that you've been making? It proves the point that your will is all you have, and your will is determined to maintain that truth and humbleness and respect. It's you that breaks that connection to it. Remember, the core wants truth only. You break those connections. You allow that facade self, which is parasitic, to take over. The doppelganger effect. And it's very easy for that to happen. You allow it to happen because you want it to happen. Part of that question you asked earlier was, how do these people become this way, and how do they turn this way? Well, it's because they see what is considered the light or the limelight and recognize that in their mind, they have no other alternative, and that there's a benefit in maintaining the status.
I just don't see.
And a hedge fund doesn't hurt.
Yeah, no, I just don't see. I get, you're right. I mean, you're correct. I'm just saying, I don't understand why someone would even have a tree would pour fruit around. Like, why would you even want to be around it? Like, why, no matter how healthy the tree is, it's still bearing fruit that is not conducive to the growth of the collective or restoring order. Like this.
Well, that's coming up in my next. I'm putting it together on how to convert, and this will cause a lot of problems for certain factions. How to convert GMO back into what it is. Think about it. This is why I said, when you get these ideas or these questions in your head that are so seemingly insurmountable, just to break it down to, or bring it back to, not down to, but bring it to the things that you readily know and have experienced. So, for example, we're looking at a so-called genetically modified food form, life form. Why is it different from its copy, its original copy? It is different. We're not going to take it to the sentient level yet. Let's keep it down to food. Okay, how is it different? It is different. It's things have been put together to make it look like what it is not. But where did those things come from? They came from that which was already here. The thing about all of these empires, very few, especially in this realm, this has been a very inept empire manifestation. The so-called Neanderthal has done a terrible job. They've done some okay things, as you know, but for the most part, they pale in comparison to the melanated ones that came before them. They were really intelligent, but very devious in many ways. But at the same time, that intelligence you have to give props to. But today, they're losing it. They don't really have it, and they're very sneaky too. But the thing is this. One thing they all have in common, you're not bringing anything that doesn't already exist here. You manifest out of nothing something, then talk to me. Everything has to come from something that's already here. And that's where the weakness is. So that which is GMO or so-called transgenic can be turned back into what it is. If I can go this way, I can go that way. And now we complicate it more into the sentient. For what does that say? Through correct mating and leaving vanity alone, because that's what stops a lot of people. Vanity. What about you? What about you? What about you? Okay, what about you? You have a purpose while you're here, but if you're getting into the mating ritual, it's not about you. It's about the offspring. And you are going to do the right thing to make sure that they don't have to go through crap. Well, if you do this meticulously and correctly, you will